I saw that, the only thing I wanted to do was go outside with my M4 carbine and just take my sweet time with that guy.
How does this fear of ethics relate to intelligence work?
I always tried to balance out nefarious things I may have had to do with good, otherwise I couldn't have lived with myself. And our enemies, they see Americans attacking each other, it's what these assholes want. They want to watch us destroy ourselves.
Had we not had the money printer as a means of funding the war on terror, how would we have funded it? Well, you would send that tax bill to U.S. households.
Yes.
So you could imagine how much resistance there would have been.
Go out there and lead it with their kids at risk. Would these wars have gone as they did?
Why was that such a disastrous withdrawal?
I thought, okay, it's still got to be a joke. Then I pull it up on the news and I'm like, you got to be shitting.
The Russia-Ukraine conflict.
That might be where this issue with the war in the Ukraine, history of Russia, Russia dying off, nuclear weapons, trafficking UFOs, that's where it ties together.
So you are a former U.S. military intelligence soldier and contractor.
Yes, sir.
We talk a lot on this show about history of military technology, largely as it pertains to money, and how all of these things have evolved over time, monetary technologies, military technologies, etc. Can we start with but I actually have not spoken before to someone like yourself, an actual intelligence professional. Can we start with just a background about you? Like, what was your story? Where did you grow up? How did you get into military intelligence? Where are you today with it? Just some background to get to know you a little bit.
Yes, sir. So I grew up most of my life in Tomball, Texas. It's just northwest of Houston. When I was about 12, I was handed a book called History of Rome by Michael Grant. I was starting to get into military history, and my grandfather heartily encouraged that. I started out by reading all I could about the Roman Empire, the Roman legions, those sorts of things, other ancient military history, Alexander the Great, the Greeks, all that. And I kind of nurtured that passion. It's what I majored in when I went to college. I was a history major, graduated from the University of St. Thomas in Houston in 2003. After that, I did 4 years in the Marine Corps, got out, actually worked as a doorman at a couple of topless strip clubs in West Houston. Heck of a lot of crazy stories there. Don't know what I was thinking. And after that, I switched services and I went into the Army, and they offered me a chance to go into military intelligence. Of course, I jumped at it, get a security clearance, do some cool stuff. And they trained me as an interrogator and what they call a HUMENTR, or a human intelligence soldier. And did that in the Army. I did a couple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. When I got out of the Army in early 2012, a little bit of a hard time in my life. We come back from that Afghanistan deployment, which more or less just sucked the life out of me. We lost a lot of people, good people. Then I went and became a contractor, doing a lot of the same things that I was doing when I was in the Army, just doing them for the DoD through various contract firms, Mission Essential Personnel, CACI, SOSI, SOSI, we used to call it, firms like that. I did that for a number of years in Afghanistan. And then I spent 6 years in the Balkans region of Europe as a counterintelligence analyst, where my job was to root out double agents. And because of that career, I have to put in this one disclaimer, if you'll just bear with me for a second. I am here on my own. Anything I say is solely my assessment and my opinions, and in no way should be taken to reflect the official views or policy of the intelligence community, the DoD, or any branch of the U.S. federal government. Sorry, I had to put that.
No, that's fine.
But I did that for 6 years in the Balkans, rooting out double agents that hostile intel services had decided to use against us. Primary reason I was actually brought there in the first place from Afghanistan. And my contract ended early 2022 as the Russian buildup in the Ukraine was happening. I was one of the few people who said, yeah, the Russians are coming. This is for real. And I was actually in the Emerald Hotel in Pristina on my way out to come back to the States when the first shots were fired and the invasion began. And since then, I've more or less become a writer.
Hmm.
That's what I am now.
So you started writing at that time.
Well, I actually had written a couple of books before that. My last year in the Marine Corps, I'd written a couple of books. I eventually took those books, and the publisher I used, Publish America, went out of business. I think they got a class action suit put against them by the Attorney General in Maryland. It was pretty big. I republished those through Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing. Then when I started writing books after that, books like The Time Killers, Mercenary Twilight, and this latest one I got, The Time Killers, Christina's Tale, they're military sci-fi time travel intelligence kind of things. I had to get all those cleared through the Department of Defense Office of Publication Security Review because I started writing those after I had the top secret SCI clearance granted to me. I have to do that for the rest of my life.
Wow. So even writing fiction, you have to get cleared.
Yes, sir. Every one that I submit, the manuscript goes to the DOD. They look at it sometimes, depending on what's in there, like I think they did with the Time Killers. They put it out to other agencies like the Air Force. I think the Department of Energy had a look at it because of some of the things that were in there at Kirtland Air Force Base. So far, they've been real good. They've cleared all of them, no issues.
Interesting. Okay. So you used a term there. Did you say human intelligence soldier?
Yes, sir.
What in the world is that?
So intelligence is divided into different disciplines, right? People hear intelligence, they automatically think James Bond chasing some sexy psycho blonde chick with a British accent and having a martini shake and not stir and doing car chases. That stuff doesn't really happen that often. Intelligence encompasses, first we'll start with what we call human intelligence. Okay, if you're in the Army or the Marine Corps, they first train you as an interrogator. Okay, then they start teaching you how to do things like sit down with people, analyze people's psychology, figure out what makes them tick. So you can basically see if you have some common interest or if the U.S. and Uncle Sam might have some common interest with that other human being you're talking to. And then you have to basically try to talk them into coming over and being willing to work for U.S. intelligence and basically get them to get you information you can't otherwise get. And human intelligence, it's a little bit more complicated than what I just said. So you have different types of human intelligence assets that you can recruit based on what level of training you've had. Okay, if you're just a basic human intelligence soldier, you can get information from, we used to say, Bob the retarded goat herder, okay, or some general knucklehead who doesn't like his cousin, right? But I was also sent to a course called the Source Operations course. That's where they train you to run what they call Category 2 sources, and those are basically people that are maybe higher level, maybe can be a little nefarious. It's where they basically start teaching you actual tradecraft, surveillance, counter-surveillance, that kind of thing, how to do things in an environment where you don't want to get caught.
Is that the same as Spycraft when you say tradecraft?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's another term for it. The penultimate level of training comes down to a couple of courses, one of which is the Field Tradecraft course, CIA, they call it the FARM. And it's become more of a well-known term. That's what we used to call it, the FARM. I didn't go to the FARM, but I did go to the Source Operations course at Fort Huachuca and other courses like the Joint Source Validation course where they actually teach you things like, what is a double agent? How do you spot one? Looking at case studies, that kind of thing. All that served me well, especially when I went to the Balkans.
Well, can you tell me a little bit more about the methods by which you detect intelligence assets, double agents, et cetera? Like, how are you parsing people's psychology? Are you looking, I assume, a lot of body language, eye contact? Like, I don't know, what types of ingredients go into this analysis that you're doing?
Best way to start off with, can't go into too much detail, but here's something interesting just to kind of let your audience know how this works. So what is a double agent, right? Let's say, okay, I'm Staff Sergeant Matt Reed. I'm an Army Humantor, and you are Vladimir Khodorov, okay? You're a colonel or whatever in the Russian GRU. You're having a bad day. You wanted to get your wife some cancer treatment and your boss told you to go pound sand. I find out about that. I say, hey, you know what, Vladimir? You know, let's talk. See what our common interests are. And you're like that recruited asset. Now let's say we've got a GRU counterintelligence officer named, say, Yuri Grulikovich. He finds out you're working for the Americans. So for example, what do the Russians do? They're a little more ruthless and brutal. They'll show up and say, oh, comrade, you are being naughty boy talking to capitalist big Americans. You don't want me to send you and wife to Siberian labor camp? You're going to do something for me. And then what they do, use you as a conduit to feed me misinformation. Like, let's say I'm getting you to give me...
Right. Once I know the leak is there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that Russian counterintelligence officer can use you as a conduit to give disinformation to U.S. intelligence and screw up our operations. And there have been cases where those type of operations have been deadly and have been run against us by various organizations, even in Afghanistan. That type of thing has gotten a lot of Americans killed, some humanitarians killed, in fact, when assets that had been flipped back, or we call it being doubled back against them, were not detected by the case officers, the guys doing the human intelligence work. So what I did was come in because there were a lot of indicators that there were some problems with some of our operations. But long story short, I was brought in to figure out who those guys were and root them out. And I was a little bit helped by the fact that some of these guys weren't necessarily geniuses, more or less. Some had big egos, talked a lot, made a lot of mistakes. Now, if you're a counterintelligence analyst, you can work with humenters to knock a guy off balance and say, okay, when you brought this up, how did he react? Things like that. And you can always dig up stuff on a human intelligence source, see if they've been a quote-unquote naughty boy or not. And I basically did that for about 6 years, rooted out a fair number of those guys. And I would say did a lot of good. Now, did I get all of them? That still eats at me to this day.
You never know, right?
You can never be 100% sure.
So this is it's information warfare, right? It's all about the flow of information between competing states. And then individuals, you're assessing these people through certain psychological typology frameworks? Are you looking at, when you try to find out what makes someone tick, you're trying to find out their primary motivations, right? So what is that approach? Are you looking at them through certain, Myers-Briggs is a psychological framework. There's the Enneagram, there's the Big Five personality test. There's all these things. Are you using any of those to typify people?
It depends on the level of the operation. If you're involved in an operation where you've identified a double and it's at a higher level, things get a lot more complicated. At my level, a lot of it was actually really simple. I would look at a guy and say, okay, Sergeant Smith, let's go over your source and tell me what you think. Then go through and say, okay, this guy is from this country. This is his religion. If he's playing straight with you, he's not just betraying his country. He's betraying his family and his religion in a culture where where the last two are cardinal sins. Some cultures betraying your country is just like whatever. So if it's tribal culture like Iraq or Afghanistan. But if he's betraying those last two, you got to stop and think, is this guy really playing straight with you? And it may be something as simple as the guy came in one time, he's usually calm as a cookie, relaxed. Now all of a sudden he's nervous and just scared to death. And maybe he starts asking things like, if something's going to happen to my wife or something, could y'all help me? Stuff like that is an indicator somebody's got this guy by the balls all of a sudden. It could be things like that. Some of them are just fairly obvious, and it was an issue of us as Americans maybe having a little too much confidence in who we are or who we think we are. We tend to think everybody wants to work with us, wants our help, wants to be like us, wants to be liberated by us. And in the initial training we get, they don't always talk much about the fact that, you can't always trust what's coming out of the guy's mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to think people automatically want to be saved by us, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and everything they say to us is going to be true. And in most cases, that's just not it.
Mm. Is that American exceptionalism creeping into the trade of spycraft?
I would say in certain cases it can.
Yeah.
That's where good non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, and guys like me have to try to guard against that.
Mm.
Like when I worked in the Balkans, we'd have these new Hugh mentors come in, good kids, well-trained, smart, real motivated, very enthusiastic, sometimes maybe a little overconfident.
Mm-hmm.
I said, okay, look, yeah, you think America's awesome. I got it.
Mm-hmm.
But these guys have a history going back 2,000 or 3,000 years. And even if they say they like American movies or they like reading Playboy magazines or whatever, you see a lot of that in Iraq, their primary loyalty is still going to be to their family and to their tribe.
Makes sense.
And if you don't take that into your planning, you are eventually going to mess up and either get yourself killed or get a bunch of your fellow soldiers killed.
I imagine this becomes much more subtle the higher the level you go. And I don't even know what higher level means. I mean, maybe higher in the hierarchy, perhaps. But you would expect that people would be much more, there'd be much more subterfuge, much more, just, I guess, playing a certain role, right? If you're a double agent, you're pretending to be someone you're not. So, like, is that a correct assumption that the game, this seems like kind of an infinite game, right? Like you could have a double agent, but then you have a triple agent. Like there's these orders of intentionality that you're dealing with. And I'm assuming at the highest levels, it probably gets really fucking confusing.
It does. It gets complicated. Also, if it's at a high enough level where it's going to have real strategic impact, you have a lot more eyes on it. You've got congressmen and senators now being read into that operation. Presidents, vice presidents. And if you're that case officer, your margin for error is barely that much. And any mistake you make, senior policymakers and elected officials are going to know pretty much all the details of how bad you screwed up.
Wow.
And the pressure on the case officers who are in that situation, especially if they're operating in a place like Moscow, which is what we call a high CI threat environment, where in case of Moscow, the minute you get on a plane to Moscow, you're an American, somebody's watching you every step of the way. You land at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, you got Russian GRU and FSB folks on you like a cheap suit.
That's every American?
It depends. If you're
a civilian going to Moscow,
you are being watched.
Wow.
Guarantee you.
Now, does that work in reverse? Someone getting on a plane in Moscow coming to New York City?
That varies dramatically.
Yeah.
If someone's getting on a plane to New York and it's a Russian general or a Russian colonel, we're going to know about that. Be like, yo, man, Colonel Carterov's coming over here. Hey, tell the FBI, go look at the guy, whatever. Yeah. But no, Moscow Station, we call it. That's where you really get into the big leagues, and the Russians are incredibly ruthless when they run their operations. They'll bumper lock your car, harass your wife and kids. They'll try to harass you to the point where you just want to leave. And so if you're going to operate successfully in that type of environment, you got to be really good at what you do, very smart, but here's the other key. You've got to be extremely, extremely patient and be cool under pressure in a place where if you're running an intelligence operation like that in Moscow, that is a part of the profession that does not forgive any error.
Wow. Does it, I guess, again, I'm trying to think about this in reverse. If your opponent, let's just say, take the very standard US, Russia kind of Cold War opponent situation here. if Russia is running these very ruthless tactics, doesn't that mean that we have to be running something similar to compete with them? Or are there different flavors of Spycraft depending on which state is running it?
There's different flavors, like you said, depending on which state is running it. There are some similarities between how a lot of countries do that, between, say, us, the Canadians, the British, the French. So it does vary a lot now. Have we run ruthless counterintelligence operations against the Russians in, say, the early 80s? Oh, yeah. In fact, late 70s, early 80s, the Russians were doing some things, and so was the East German Stasi, that were really getting out of hand. We had told them to back off some of the things they were doing. They weren't doing it. So the Reagan administration basically said, okay, boys, y'all really want to play rough? The gloves are coming off. And I don't know if you ever watched that TV show, The Americans. It was a show on FX about what are called sleeper agents, right? So when you have your intelligence agents, they have their case officers just like we have ours, right? And then we're doing surveillance, counter surveillance, trying to figure out which diplomat at that embassy is the case officer, right? Been going on for decades back and forth. Sleepers are something a little bit different. They come in maybe the long route. Russian sleeper agents might have, or East German sleeper agents, they sometimes use those guys. They might start off by immigrating to Canada first, getting established there, then immigrate to the U.S. and get citizenship, open up a business, and then years down the road, they leave some kind of a signal of some sort for a specially trained case officer at, say, the Russian embassy in Washington. And then that's when the operation kicks off. And maybe they try to get them into a position. Maybe they try to get them working for a major U.S. defense contractor. Even if they can only get a secret clearance, that's still access to classified information that the Russians are going to need to satisfy their version of what we call PIRs, or priority intelligence requirements, which are basically, what does that country want to know?
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, it reminds me of that phrase that the slow knife eludes detection, right? So the sleeper agents just very slowly working their way into the information that they're seeking.
Absolutely. The good example of that, this gets into a little pre-World War II military history. After the Communist Revolution, the Russians started running subversive intelligence operations, mostly in Europe, but some in the U.S. And they set up sleeper networks all throughout Western and Central Europe in the 20s and 30s. And the network they ran then was sometimes referred to as the Red Orchestra. And German intelligence in World War II, the Abwehr and the SD, which was Nazi SS counterintelligence, which was run by a guy named Reinhard Heydrich. They call him the man with the iron heart. What he was doing in Prague, Czechoslovakia, in a lot of cases, was trying to root out those Russian sleeper agents that they knew were there. It was one of the reasons why he did a lot of the brutal shit that he did, hanging people with piano wire, so on and so forth. But yeah, it's like you said, the slow knife, you lose detection. That is what a sleeper agent operation is.
Wow. So I imagine someone like that's trying to root out sleeper agents is probably taking a scorched earth approach to some extent, because you don't really know who the sleeper agents are. You're probably trying to engage some scare tactics, as you just said, some excessive brutality. Seems like you would end up with a lot of collateral damage trying to root out these sleeper agents. Is that a fair?
Depending on how you run those operations, you can.
Yeah.
We do have people in our intelligence community in the FBI who in the past have rooted those people out and have managed to do it, to their credit, without any collateral damage to any innocent American citizens. And as a result of that, that's why these operations took so long. Anna Chapman, remember her? They rooted her out. But rooting out those sleeper agents, depending on how you do it, because of how difficult it is and how well placed they are, it's so hard to sort out which is which, right? Give you an example of something a little bit along those lines. So back in 2012, when I was working in Afghanistan, there was an Afghan general named Abdul Razik. You talk to anyone in the U.S. intelligence community who worked in Afghanistan then, they all got stories about this dude.
Mhm.
This guy was a piece of work, but in a good way for us.
Mhm.
He was a brutal, ruthless SOB. The Taliban spent I don't know how much money trying to kill this guy.
Mhm.
And he had become what we call the PCOP, the Provincial Chief of Police in Kandahar. When he took over, enemy activity was kind of up here. It had dropped down to like all the way here. So the guy was so brutal and ruthless. But he had his own personal security detail. They tried to kill him. They walked him into an ambush, and then one of his security detail actually pulled out, I think it was a Makarov, and then tried to shoot him. Razik knocked the guy's hand away, killed the guy, got out alive. He shot his way through an ambush.
Wow.
And when it was over, because Razik was not stupid, he knew his inner circle had been penetrated, probably by the Kedishur and the Taliban's kind of spiritual overlords, if you want to call them that. He didn't know who it was. He knew there was at least a couple other people who had betrayed him, so he just killed all of them. Lined them up, shot every last one of them just to be sure. That's one of those places where if you go scorched earth, yeah, you can end up with a lot of collateral damage. Absolutely.
I mean, I guess before we go further, the question is just hammering me. It's like the ethicality. How do these people involved in these lines of work? You mentioned the man with the iron heart. Like, does everyone have to evolve themselves to the point of having an iron heart to do this kind of work? Like, is there any place for the heart in intelligence? How does the sphere of ethics even relate to intelligence work?
So that's a tough one. I'll answer it as best I can.
Yeah.
When I was going through training, they were laying things out for us. You're going to be working with some cases, some very nefarious characters. They might genuinely be some very evil people. They might even be former insurgents who could have killed your fellow soldiers or Marines years earlier. What they trained us to do is say, look, they've got information that can save American lives. You may not like the guy you're sitting across from. There were times when I was sitting across from guys, the only thing I wanted to do was put a bullet in their head and send them right to the infernal regions. But they had information that could prevent Americans from getting killed, maimed, or crippled, right? And you had to think about it that way. Most of the time, that helped out a lot as far as the ethicality of it. Now, there are some people we would run into that did some really horrible things. When I was in Afghanistan, for example, it's a little hard to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. We had some Afghans come onto our fob, and through various security checks, and we were going to talk to these guys because we thought some of them might have information. One of these Afghans had a lot of videos with him of child rape, where it looked like some Pakistani smugglers were raping some young girls with some devices. Now, when you've come across that information, it has to be reported. And if you're a young man and you have to look at that and watch that, it sears itself into your mind. Throughout my life, since I've come back from there, it occasionally pops into my head and I have to grit my teeth and suppress it because it'll turn my stomach and I won't be able to eat. And you think, look at what that guy did to that little girl. And when I saw that, the only thing I wanted to do was go outside with my M4 carbine and just take my sweet time with that guy. Now, if I had done that, I would have been court-martialed and probably tried for war crimes. But you run across things like that, you have to take a deep breath, check your rage, check your ego, and remember, you're trying to get information that will save American lives, soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen, or American citizens. The way I used to deal with knowing that I had to do a lot of shady, underhanded things, even as a counterintelligence analyst, you do some shady, underhanded things that would not maybe be ethical in most normal jobs. What I try to do is when I was in these foreign countries, I sometimes would run across some foreign people that were actually really good people. They were in a bind. They needed help with something. I would do everything I could to help them out, whether it was, help them fix up their house or go talk to the brigade commander and say, hey, Colonel Smith, Colonel, Johnson, whatever. I think it would be good if we went out and, gave that guy's daughter some medical treatment. The doctor that said her leg didn't do a good job, wasn't a good hospital. I always tried to balance out the nefarious things I may have had to do with good. Otherwise, I couldn't have lived with myself.
Yeah. So trying to compensate for the sins maybe that you have to engage in the craft. I'm hearing you use the terms like good people, bad people. Obviously, this forces you to develop a pretty sophisticated philosophy of good and evil. I may be jumping ahead, and I don't mean to be, but I'm trying to get a real good grounding for your perspective on all of this before we go. There's a lot of stories here that we're going to go into. Could you just speak to that? Your philosophy on good and evil, how it has changed as a result of doing this work and pursuing this career path? Like what is it and how has it changed over time?
Good question. So growing up, I was raised by wonderful parents, grandfather, all ex-military, grandparents served in World War II. My dad was in the Marine Corps, was a Vietnam vet, got some decorations. Very much believed in America, even though, he was very angry about how a lot of things went in the Vietnam War. Gave me a very, very good upbringing of right and wrong. And my father, while he raised me in that fashion, he and my grandfather always challenged me to think, even things that were ethical. Okay, think this through. Are you sure that guy is really bad for doing that? Do you know what precipitated what happened? That kind of thing. Now, going to churches growing up, I went to a Lutheran church because my father was a very devout Roman Catholic and my mother was a Methodist. that made for an interesting upbringing. But they looked at everything as black and white. There's only God and there's only Satan. It's either evil or ultimate good. And that was what we got from the church and from Sunday school. And I, got my history degree. Then I went in the Marine Corps, then into military intelligence. Then I did my deployments overseas, all these different places. And I learned that it's just not that simple. There are some things that are objectively evil. I don't doubt that. And some things that are objectively wonderful and good. But the majority of the world's population operates in that gray area.
Yeah.
You may see, you may be working overseas and you may, for example, see an Iraqi intelligence officer put a guy on his knees and blow his brains out, right? And you say, okay, you don't know if that guy was guilty, whatever, you murdered a guy. That's supposedly objectively bad. But then you find out that guy was part of an insurgent group that sawed his wife's head off and sent him a video of it. And you think, okay, well, what would I have done if I thought I could get away with it? Part of the reason I probably didn't, go out and kill the guy with those nasty videos is I knew I'd get tried for war crimes. So am I really that different from that guy? If I was, you meet a lot of people that you see the history of the nation they're in and the history of what they've been through, and you have to think, okay, if I was that person,
right?
If I was born here, if I experienced that trauma, would I be any different? And so it makes me think back to when I had my upbringing. It was a very good civil upbringing. But a lot of the good folks that I grew up with at the Lutheran church that I went to, occasionally you do meet people who can be a little judgmental. And I think maybe the reason is a lot of people in those environments, in those safe American environments, they've never suffered trauma. I mean, real trauma that just comes out of nowhere and you have no control over it. And so now I look at things with a lot more nuance. I don't just assume when I hear somebody doing something on the news, it's automatically evil. I want to get more information.
Right.
That's kind of how it changed for me.
So a more sophisticated view
Yes, sir.
of the the gradations or gray area between black and white, good or evil,
Yes,
that
sir.
actually, well, what is it? The world's full of people with competing interests, right? And occasionally, everyone has their own purpose, path of purpose that they're on, and often we come to cross purposes. And when we come to cross purposes, people resolve those conflicts violently, non-violently, ethically, non-ethically, and then that sort of compounds on itself. You have a lot of history, as you said. You may see someone engaging in a gruesome act, but you don't know the backstory, right? That's it's got to be a lot to deal with. It seems like maybe this is one of the qualities of just getting older and more mature, is that you really do start to be more and more humbled by the complexity of the world.
Absolutely, yes,
the
sir.
complexity of human psychology. Yeah, it's a lot. As you said, these young guys you mentioned earlier, where they're smart, they're hungry, they're enthusiastic, but they tend to be a little overconfident, right? They haven't
many
seen
times.
enough, they haven't been through enough yet of pain to get that humility sort of baked into them, I suppose. In Bitcoin, we often dream about the idea of forming citadels, which are independent, self-sovereign communities that have their own energy, food, and water resources. Today, that dream is becoming a reality at the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a 705-acre regenerative agriculture community located at the Florida-Georgia line near Folkston, Georgia. The farm is known as the healthiest place on earth, and it includes orchards, organic standing gardens, regenerative animal pastures, berry fields, and much, much more. Today, the farm features 25 custom-built cabins and has plans to construct 225 more in the years ahead. The farm has its own food, energy, and water sources and is completely off-grid. So if you're looking to join a Citadel community comprised of sovereign individuals, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about membership. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on custom cabin pricing. Again, that's okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. I want to ask you about your role as an interrogator.
Yes, sir.
Because again, this is, I guess warfare is information warfare, right? If you know what your opponent's going to do before they do it and you have predictive power on them, that means you have a superior strategy or strategic advantage, at least. And it's a constant process of trying to get that strategic advantage on top of your opponent. So clearly interrogation is primary to warfare, or it doesn't even have to be warfare, right? This could also just be business competition, right? If you can get one up on your opponent from an information standpoint in business, obviously that's a very significant advantage, if not the significant advantage. So what did your role as an interrogator look like when the rubber meets the road? Were there specific techniques? Like what is your mindset? How do you approach the occupation? And, are there specific tips, tricks, techniques you were using to interrogate people?
I'm going to talk about that quite a bit. So first thing is, people hear interrogator, they automatically think waterboarding and ripping out their fingernails, right? I'm sure a lot of people watch this are going to be thinking that.
Yeah.
So we were prohibited from doing that. but it was so much more to it. Like I said, a lot of it was psychological. Some of it could just be as simple as, hey, Ahmed, that guy you killed, I don't judge you for it, brother. I totally get it. You know, my grandpa was a farmer. Somebody stomped on my crops. You know, I would have shot that guy too. Then Ahmed is like, oh, well, thank you, Mr. Whoever, Mr. Scott. So when I got to Iraq, okay, I was pretty enthusiastic about being an interrogator. When I got there, I graduated Fort Huachuca, and then I went to Fort Wainwright, Alaska for a few weeks, processed in, and then I went straight to Iraq because that unit, the 1st of the 25th Infantry, the Stryker Brigade unit, was already there. So I got there the last 6 months of that deployment. So I was the junior most interrogator, green as green can be. I get there, and I was fortunate. I had a couple of good NCOs, Staff Sergeant Talling Dan, Sergeant Kim, and a good Chief Warrant Officer named Dave Crampton. I miss all those guys so much. They sat me down and said, look, don't think you really know how to be an interrogator because you graduated that course at Fort Huachuca. You're about to find out how little you actually know. And I was still kind of enthusiastic. I thought, okay, the first guy I interrogated, I'm like, hey, Chief, I'm going to go in there and break this guy like a twig. You know, man, I know what I'm doing. I got it together. I go in there, completely screwed up that first interrogation. Of course, it's all taped.
Yeah.
And some senior intelligence officers were watching the whole thing. And they went through afterwards and dissected it and said, these are all the mistakes you made, Reed. And I'm like, Roger, Sergeant. He's like, okay, I've chewed your butt a little bit. Did you learn anything? I said, yes, I did. And they said, okay, we've got another guy we're going to have you interrogate. This guy was a sheikh. He was one of the number 2 terrorists in Iraq at the time. And another interrogator had worked the guy over, couldn't get the guy to cooperate. We call it breaking. We can get him to break, as we say. They said, you're going to have a couple of chances to go at it. And I did a 7-hour and 45-minute nonstop interrogation on this guy. It was like mental jujitsu. I was exhausted when it was done. And this guy was a pretty bad dude. This is where that you got to put your ego and your anger aside and focus on the information of what you can do and save with it. This guy had run a network of EFP, explosively formed projectile cells, that had killed and maimed some of our Cav scouts, blew right through the strikers, killed a few of our guys. And we caught the guy by accident. They kicked open a door and the guy's like he didn't expect to be caught. So I go to interrogate him and I realize this guy is actually really freaking smart. I realize I'm not half as smart as I thought I was. And so that was one of the things that I learned. Now, the information piece, that gets into something else. So your basic function of what you do in intelligence, no matter what you do, whether you're a satellite imagery analyst, a communications intercept analyst at the NSA, or doing what I do, the first thing intelligence exists to do is to identify who a country's enemies are and obviously figure out a way to defeat them. You first do that by doing the same thing, ascertaining your enemy's intent. Okay, you first identify your foes and defeat them by knowing their intent. Analogy, if I can use an analogy here. Let's say we're in country A, okay, you and I are in charge of it. We have a country B, which is next door, has comparable economic and military capability. But while they have the potential to be a threat because of their military capability, they want to form an alliance and do business. Okay. Now you've got country C over here on the left, little country, but it's full of a bunch of whack jobs who have publicly said, we want to kill you and kill your citizens. Who's the actual greater threat? The difference is intent. That's one of the first things overall intelligence has to look for is intent. Now with interrogation, the reason that was so vital in Iraq, the Iraqis, a lot of their insurgent leaders and people that had training them were former Republican Guard officers. But they had maybe years ago been trained by the United States in the 80s. They had a basic understanding of radios and cell phones and how that technology worked. They were not in any way unsophisticated in that regard. And they had been trained in tradecraft by us and the British back in the 80s. And so they use good basic tradecraft to avoid detection, dead drops, couriers, proxies. Okay, they didn't use emails or cell phones. So in a lot of cases, our more sophisticated collection methods were basically blind in some cases. So let's say we want to figure out where an insurgent cell is operating that keeps killing our guys. Okay, $1 billion satellite in low Earth orbit can take a nice photograph of a compound. It's maybe half a square mile. Okay, good. We know where it is. That's a nice, pretty picture. But if you've got an infantry guy on the ground, you need to know they got all those doors and walls. What's inside those walls and rooms, and what's behind that door? You could take satellite photos of that blasted thing till you run out of energy on the satellite. The infantry guys need to know when we kick in that door, what's waiting for us on the other end. And the only way you get that information is to grab a human intelligence source, either through recruitment or interrogation, who knows what's there, and extract that information out of their minds in some form or fashion. And so that's where the old low-tech methods are what we had to focus on in a lot of cases in Iraq. Because you can do, even if you get a guy's cell phone, and he's talking dirty with his girlfriend, Safira or whatever, okay, that's great. And we know where he is at all times. But in that compound, if you're going to send soldiers, Marines, or in case of the FOB where I worked at, we had a SEAL platoon there. Okay, if you're the SEAL team commander, you're Commander Breedlove, you're going to come to me and say, hey, Sergeant Reed, that's a nice photograph. I don't give a shit about that. I need to know what's behind that door in those rooms so my guys don't get killed. Make sure there's not fish hooks strung down from the ceiling. They might have trip wires hooked to claymores and Semtex. Those are the types of things.
Yeah.
And the only way you get that is with a human intelligence source that has eyes on and has that information.
And so what, can you get specific on the interrogation techniques? I know you said it's not waterboarding and fingernail pulling. So what are the techniques by which you extract this critical information for SEAL teams to operate?
It varies. Most of the specific strategies I'm not allowed to talk about, but it varies. There's no set way to do it. You can sometimes get information from someone without using any actual real techniques or strategy if you plan it out right. I'll give you an example. There was a German interrogator in World War II who was assigned to interrogate Allied POWs, pilots who had been shot down. No torture, never argued, never raised his voice, took good care of them, made sure they had good food. Here's what he would do. He would go on walks with them and just get them talking. Say, hey, tell me about that air-to-air dogfight you were in with that Focke-Wulf 190. And the American might say, well, I knew I was done when I saw a lot of tracers coming out of the barrels. And the interrogator says, well, why? And he might say, oh, that means we're about to run out of ammo. Now he's got a vital piece of information through just casual conversation he can give to the German Wehrmacht, the German Luftwaffe, do a more effective job of killing us now in Iraq. Here's how it could go down. Say you've got Abdullah, okay, and you've rolled him up in a cordon search. And you don't know if he's an insurgent or not, but you get the guy talking. And he mentions, Mr. Matt, Mr. Scott, whatever, I had to get off the road because there were 5 rocks stacked on it. This is where there's a lot of nuance. You have to listen for these types of details because a little detail like that is significant. You say, well, wait a minute, Abdullah, what was it about those 5 rocks that made you want to go the other way? And he says, oh, well, Mr. Smith, that's how the insurgents in Jaish al-Mahdi mark where they put an IED. Go, what? You write that down, you get that information, you say, hey, thanks, man. Here's a hamburger and a Dr. Pepper, I promise you. Sleep well. And then you run and you take that information to the soldiers, Marines, or the SEALs. Now, just through that, you save a bunch of lives because now they've got an indicator to know where the IEDs are planted.
So now, it's like decrypting in a way. You're decrypting.
Yes.
That's a sign, right? It's a signal, a symbol, something. So you are decrypting that and then passing that information into the broader intelligence and military community to protect themselves against that threat.
Absolutely.
So intention is critical, right? It's not just the information itself, but it's also what individuals or groups intend to do, right? What is their aim? What is their purpose? Obviously, that's not something people are going to tell you willingly, right? That's something that, especially in times of conflict or competition, I mean, we use the term in business, trade secrets, right? Like you want to be secretive about it. The secret sauce is another term they use in business. These things tend to be proprietary, right? It's not something you want to share openly. How do you, I appreciate what you shared there, but it sounds like those techniques might not be adequate to get to people's intention. Are there different techniques applied if it's just getting information about, like you said, the 5 rocks next to the road versus getting to the intention of someone? It just seems like there would be a different approach. Am I right in making that assumption?
There are a lot of different approaches. A lot of the stuff you see law enforcement use, we do a lot of the same stuff.
Correct.
With just some minor differences here and there. Most people are not going to give that information up willingly.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can elicit the information from one guy, go talk to another guy, and then you get with the analyst and you try to piece it together. So, okay, well, what might these guys really be doing? Now, there are harsher methodologies that some countries do use. If you're talking about the Russians or even some of our East European allies, they don't have the same methods and, shall we say, rules that we do. They have some pretty effective methods for extracting the information. Now, when people hear that, they automatically think just pure torture, right? No, there's more to it than that. The Russians, for example, might use a combination of nonstop interrogation, threats, fear, sleep deprivation. Hell, the Russians even perfected brainwashing techniques for interrogation back in the Cold War. The details, I believe, on what they were actually able to accomplish are probably still classified, so I can't discuss them here. But they really got some of that down to almost an art form.
Isn't it true that people under certain intensities of torture will just admit to the crime or whatever it is just to get the torture to stop? So they'll just say whatever the interrogator wants them to say, basically.
That's why my view as an interrogator and what we were taught is that is not generally the best method to use.
It's not going to get you the truth.
No. In the case of the Russians, they have a very brutal bureaucratic culture in their intelligence agencies. Okay. They're desperate to do something to please their bosses as fast as possible. So if they look weak, they'll be targeted by their leadership. That happened a lot in the Cold War. Under Stalin happened a lot. So sometimes they'll do that to just get something up front so they can say, oh, comrade, look, I got something faster than comrade Yuri over here. Aren't I awesome? And you can get some useful stuff like that right off the bat. But they just want the pain to stop. They're probably going to tell you anything. And if they know you're that desperate for the information that you're willing to torture them, you're not going to be able to take the time to analyze the information they give you. A guy who's trained in, say, interrogation resistance techniques, I've dealt with people that were trained in that, they'll throw in, if someone's working on them, they'll throw in some disinformation that they know is going to cause you problems. And know you'll probably take it and run with it. So it gets a lot more. It gets a lot more complicated.
Do they probably start to mix information with disinformation? I would imagine, just to throw you a bone, then you think they're telling the truth, and they'll try to disinform you.
If you're dealing with someone who might be a trained intelligence officer from, say, the Russian GRU or the SVR or Chinese Ministry of State Security or even the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, they train some good operators. They're going to be ready for that. And what they'll teach them to do is give disinformation with some things that are true that maybe you're okay with letting go, knowing, okay, if we can verify that this piece of the information is true, be less likely to suspect the other piece of information as being disinformation. And so the whole torture thing, not the best way to get the reliable long-term information you're going to need. It takes sophistication and it takes
Patience.
a lot of patience.
Yeah. Have you ever, I mean, I can only imagine the culture of an intelligence agency, because you also, I mean, you have to apply that same framing to your own internal hierarchy, right? Like, how do you know the information you're being given by your own intelligence agency on these targets, interrogation targets, or whatever you want to call them, is accurate and true? Like, it just seems like this is a great way to cultivate a very paranoid personality. I mean, just talking about it, I'm like, I feel like I wouldn't trust fucking anyone day in, day out. I don't think I'd trust my boss. I don't think I'd trust my coworkers. I wouldn't trust obviously the targets, right? That's the people I'm interrogating. I'm trained not to trust them. I'm trained to extract information from them. How do you deal with that confusion? Yeah.
So because I worked the military side of things, it was actually a little bit simpler. When you work in the military side of things, your fellow soldiers might be satellite analysts, imagery analysts, other intelligence disciplines. So when they're giving me information on someone, I can actually look at the information and see where they got it. And I personally know the guys who have analyzed it and looked at it. And so it's not going to be in their best interest to lie to me, because in a military unit, that trust is so paramount.
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, that wasn't too much of an issue. Now, when you get up into the strategic side, you get into places like Washington, D.C.
Yes, exactly.
That's where things can get really, really screwed up. You obviously saw how the Iraq War played out. And before that thing kicked off, the source we had was a guy codenamed Curveball. That was where the Bush administration was getting a lot of their information. And in the initial investigation, our intelligence people and our allies looked at this guy and said, we think he's full of crap. Because he was giving us information saying there's stuff here and there's stuff here. We look at it on a map, we're like, dude, there's nothing here. Right? But you had some people in Washington who took that information and ran with it. And when people heard we have intelligence that says this, a lot of American people may take that at face value.
Sure.
Okay. For example, let's say I'm the president of the United States, and let's say, you're a senator or somewhere in the business community that I decide I don't like for whatever reason. If by some chance someone in the intelligence world does a communications intercept and here's some Russian saying, Robert Breedlove is an alien from his 82 reticuli, okay? We grab that information, okay? Because that is communications intercept using sophisticated technological devices, it is now highly classified, probably what we call the SCI, sensitive compartment and information level. Now, maybe the guy's just joking around because he saw you on TV and thinks he's being funny. But if I'm the president and I say, I have highly classified intelligence that says Robert Breedlove is an alien from Z82 reticuli in a human body, I'm technically not lying. You go, oh, highly classified intelligence, James Bond must have gotten it. So understand the information is classified based on the sources, methods, and tools used to get it. Classification has absolutely nothing to do with whether it's truthful.
Right.
That's something people got to understand.
That's an important distinction, because I think people do take that at face value. The more highly classified information is, that it must be more truthful somehow.
Not in any way.
But it's just the means by which it was obtained,
yes, sir.
Basically. Okay, so let's go back to Curveball.
Yes, sir.
What could Curveball just have been a made up informant? It was an informant, I guess. Is that what you call that? Could it have just been a fabricated informant to give Washington, D.C., for lack of a better term, an excuse to go into war in the Middle East? Like, is it this type of spycraft where you have to start to suspect your own government of these activities? How does that play into your mental model of this game?
So, as far as the Iraq War goes.
And if you wanted to use a non-specific
Sure.
instance or a historical instance, that's fine as well. I understand maybe you don't want to talk directly about the U.S. government, but I'm just trying to understand, how do you learn to trust where the orders are coming from?
That becomes a little more complicated. So when you're in, say, a military unit, you have to at least try to trust that the senior staff NCOs, officers above you, are giving you the right sort of orders.
Mm.
And when I look back on it, I can't necessarily fault them for the orders they gave me at the operational and tactical level. Here's who I can fault. This is where I'm going to venture into maybe some slightly dangerous territory, but I'm going to say it anyway. It needs to be said. Our political class in Washington, when they sent us to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, a huge mistake they made. This is like Warfare 101. The Romans and the Greeks and the Persians would not have made this mistake. What caused so many problems, the problems came from the top down. They did not give us a clear objective that the military could achieve and that we could use to focus our resources like a laser into achieving. Okay? I'll give you an example. When I say a clear objective, I got to give an example. What do I mean so people can kind of wrap their heads around this? So in Afghanistan, every year the stated reason for us being there changed. First, it was to kill bin Laden. Then it was to go after al-Qaeda, then finish off the Taliban, after al-Qaeda again. Then it was voting. Then it was democracy. Then it was women's rights, yada, yada, yada. Let's imagine you got two SWAT teams, okay? SWAT Team A, best training, best equipment, best guys you can imagine. SWAT Team B, good, but not as well trained, not as well equipped. But SWAT Team B has a streamlined chain of command, and they have a clear objective. We're going to go into that house, we're going to kill those child sex traffickers, get the kids out, and then we're getting the hell out of here. Boom, simple. SWAT Team A, maybe they got a big bureaucracy on top of them. Nobody can decide what they're trying to achieve.
Moving goalpost.
Exactly. So they say, okay, what are we trying to do? Well, let's go shoot some bad guys. So go in and start shooting. Then they say, hey, let's shoot some pit bulls. They shoot some pit bulls. Let's go win the hearts and minds of this section of the neighborhood over here. Let's go fix trees. Let's do this. And before you know it, they're broke, out of ammo, costs are going through the roof, okay? And yet they are qualitatively the better SWAT team. What was the difference? SWAT Team B had a clear objective.
Right.
SWAT Team A did not. So in Afghanistan, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Special Ops community, the CIA, the Tier 1 operators, other special operations units, the State Department, were all pursuing these different objectives, many of which were diametrically opposed to one another. So they're telling the conventional forces, try to win their hearts and minds. It's not going to ever work in Afghanistan. These people are almost hardwired to fight off occupiers. It's just how they are. It's part of their history. And special ops guys are like, let's go kill these people. So you're telling the conventional guys, be nice to these people, and telling another group of guys, go kill them. How can you achieve an objective when your sub-objectives are diametrically opposed to one another? So our policymakers did not give us a clear objective, or say, example, World War II, good example. What was our objective? It was to crush and annihilate the German and Japanese empires and secure their unconditional surrender by any means necessary. That's it. Any diplomat, soldier, general, or American citizen could articulate that, and they all knew what the game plan was and what the objective was. So we applied overwhelming force to achieve that objective. Firebombing civilian populations was part of it, the atomic bombs, to crush their will to fight and bring them to their knees as fast as possible. Desert Storm, clear objective. We're going to isolate the Iraqi army, we're going to kill it, and we're going to eject them from Kuwait and eliminate their ability to be a threat. Boom, simple. Vietnam, no clear objective. Iraq, we got Saddam Hussein, and then we said, hey, let's stay and try to make Iraq into Wisconsin or Denmark. If you're that's the painful thing is when I was in the military, having been a trained military historian, I can't describe the anger and frustration I had and seeing something. I'm like, guys, I'm educated in the history of this place. This isn't going to do the trick.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't going to work. But if you're a lowly lance corporal or a sergeant, think some general gives a damn what I think?
Right.
That was one of the sources of my anger and frustration over the wars.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you've been a military historian, you by necessity, or by definition even, you have zoomed out to think about these things in a bigger, larger perspective, a more encompassing perspective. And so I'm sure it could be frustrating operating at the micro scale with people that are probably, again, by definition, operating with much more limited perspectives. I could see that would create a lot of frustration. Would there have been a purpose to create that type of disunity when you're describing that we have no clear objectives and you're having even contra objectives, right? Be nice to these guys, kill these guys, all within the purview of the U.S. military community, I guess, for the broadest possible term. Well, does that indicate what the intention might have been coming out of the political class in the war in Iraq? Like, why would they want to do that? Was it just, I've heard Balaji put it this way, it's all, don't ascribe to evil intent or bad intent, which you can ascribe to stupidity. Like, was it evil or stupid or a combination of both?
From my perspective, it was more stupidity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, other people in other areas may have a different perspective. Don't just take what I say as gospel, but it came down to more stupidity, a lack of knowledge of history. For example, when I worked my way up through the intelligence community on different levels, I had a chance to interact with congressmen, senators, and a lot of our 3 and 4 stars, some of whom you've seen on the news over the years. I knew some of those people. And when I would talk to them, I'd be like, hey, General so-and-so, can you please tell me what our objective is? I can't do my job now as an intelligence analyst if I don't know what we're trying to accomplish here. And I had some senior officers say, Mr. Reed, we're here because we're here. And you ask congressmen and senators,
That's a fucking nonsense phrase I've ever heard of.
I'd like, Senator so-and-so, what are we trying to achieve here? I couldn't get a straight answer from anybody. In fact, to his credit, regardless of what anybody thinks of him, then Vice President Joe Biden visited Afghanistan. I think it was during President Obama's first term. He went around asking soldiers and Marines, what are we trying to accomplish here? He said, I got 40 different answers from everybody. What the hell's going on here? Strategic drift, we might call it. It goes back to not having a clear objective. So when I look at what the results have been, we're trillions of dollars in debt. That is not a good thing. I don't care how you want to slice it or parse it. Lost thousands of some of our best young people through death, through being crippled. These wars were not good for our military because the type of warfare we had to fight is different from what we might fight with Russia or China or North Korea. And the way I ascribe it to stupidity is when I interact with a lot of these people, some of them really drank their own Kool-Aid and really thought, some of them thought everything was going good and that we were doing the right thing. They just want to have democracy. And when I looked at that, I'm like, y'all ever study the history of this place? We're not the first, say, in Iraq or even Afghanistan. We're not the first Western power to come in here. Alexander the Great did it in ancient times. Iraq was occupied by Alexander the Great, invaded it. The Romans invaded it a couple times. They actually did it right. They went in with a clear objective, burned down the capital city of the Parthians in Mesopotamia, and just turned around and got out, let it collapse into anarchy. Now, if our objective was to create disunity and collapse it into anarchy, all we had to do was go in, kill Saddam Hussein, and probably turn around and come out. That would have done the trick just fine. Instead, by giving, say, Iraqis a right to vote, their majority population are Shiites, not Sunnis, not Kurds, not Zoroastrians or anything like that. So we essentially just created a bigger, stronger Iran, and we still haven't been able to extricate ourselves from that quagmire we created. So from what I saw, lack of knowledge of military history, and yes, I include some of our nation's flag officers in this, that they were buying into the so-called coin counterinsurgency doctrine. And any military historian worth his salt would have looked at that coin doctrine and torn it to shreds, because we were dealing with like an ethno-religious insurgency. They were thinking in terms of, I guess, political insurgencies like the IRA in Northern Ireland. You know, those are easy. You give the Marxists or whoever a power sharing agreement, give them suits and ties, make them part of the government, whatever.
Yeah.
These other types of insurgencies, to be quite blunt, the only method that has ever worked to eliminate them is either one, turn around and leaving because the foreign presence is what's fueling it. So you take away the fuel.
Yeah.
But if it's a place you don't want to leave, only method that's ever worked has just been utmost genocide and brutality, like what the Romans did to the Iceni in Britain after the Boudiccan revolt, pretty much killed them off. What the British did in India in 1835, or the Boers in South Africa, what the Russians did to the Chechens. I'm not saying we should do that. Don't anybody misunderstand me. But as a historian, facts are what they are.
Right.
And so I saw all this stuff going on, and it wasn't like these generals were bad people, or they were like stupid, not like, you know, nothing up there.
Right.
But
just not taking the macro historical view.
They weren't doing that. And then there was another problem I got to bring up here is with information flows. So information we collect at the bottom, it's supposed to flow to the top to the generals, the Joint Chiefs, and the policymakers. Okay, job and intelligence, inform policy. One of the things that I saw happen constantly, we would do intelligence collection and then analysis. The analysis we did at the ground level in Iraq or Afghanistan was actually painting an accurate picture of just how jacked up this whole thing was. Well, for various reasons, it has to go through different echelons. You want to have some echelons to check information, look for biases, that kind of thing. Nothing wrong with that. But there were so many echelons that the information had to go through. And you have
distorted.
Yes, you had a lot of ambitious majors and colonels who frankly had their nose up the rear end of every flag officer that walked by. And what they would do is they might say, hey, Sergeant Reed, that's a little harshly worded. We need to polish your assessment. Those assessments got polished so many times through the different echelons that by the time they get in front of the Joint Chiefs chairman or a congressman or a senator or the commander-in-chief, that original intelligence assessment that looked like a pile of cow crap has been polished so much it now looks like a dusty diamond.
Sugar coating.
That was a huge problem.
Wow. So the sugar coating, and what was the motivation for the sugar coating? Just to...
It's all over the ballpark. You know, I saw this in certain cases when you have staffs that are around a lot of senior flag officers. Flag officers have a lot of power within a certain context. And you do sometimes get what we call strap hangers.
Yeah.
Okay, you may have heard that term before. These strap hangers just want the general to be happy. So he'll sign their officer evaluation report.
It's like a brown noser in business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they also wanted to present this in front of Congress in a way that might please the generals. And you saw a lot of generals testify in front of Congress saying, everything's good. We just got some challenges. The Afghans are about to love democracy. They're going to do all this.
So the fear of propagating bad news, or the desire to people please, perhaps even?
Definitely. That's
wow.
Now, from a military history perspective, the ancient civilizations solved that problem before it even began. You look at the Greeks and the Romans, at least the Romans up to about the late 3rd century AD, and of course the Greeks before them. By custom and law, to be a Roman senator, 6 to 8 years in the Roman legions active duty on campaign at war, before you could work your way up and throw your hat in the ring to become a senator, for example. To keep your Senate seat, your sons had to be serving as tribunes in the Roman army.
Skin
the
in
consuls,
the
game. Skin in the game. Consuls, the praetors. So the Roman policymakers, we would call them the civilian policymakers in D.C. In ancient Roman Greece, those policymakers by law were out there on the front lines with the men. If they represented a province or an area they had administrative control over, by law and custom, they had to put on body armor, strap on a sword, and go out there and hook and jab, stab, and mutilate with the legionaries. So their policymakers, because they were on or near the front lines with the troops, they knew exactly what was really going on, what really happened, and what needed to be done. And the way our systems are,
exactly backwards.
Yeah, it's exactly backwards.
Yeah.
Our political class, this is something that is objectively true.
Yeah.
Since the end of the Korean War, has really never had skin in the game in any of the wars we've gone to, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and whatnot. And with, say, the Romans, if they were going to go to war to retaliate for, say, the ambush in the Teutoburg Forest, if they were going to select someone to be a general, what we would call a general, was not a permanent position. They were selected for a specific mission and a specific target set. And the senior NCO Corps, the Centurions, like their version of gunnery sergeants, got to weigh in on who those generals were going to be. It wasn't just a political process. And so because of the way our systems are with them not having skin in the game, it robs them of the knowledge they need to make wise policy choices or decisions, because they're 7,000 miles away. The only thing those congressmen and senators know, and I'm not saying this automatically reflects badly on them as people, is you got a general in front of you with all kind of fruit salad on his chest, all these tabs and everything else. He's telling you everything's going good, unless that senator, like Senator McCain did, had a son in the Marine Corps. They have no way to know if those guys are lying or manipulating. Whereas in ancient Rome, you couldn't BS the Senate because they were your peers. They had been in the army.
Yeah.
And of course, in ancient Rome, if a general failed to achieve his objective, they were executed.
Wow, that's such an excellent point. And a problem with centralization overall, right? That this whole disconnect from the reality of the situation and the proverbial ivory tower. It just leads to poor decision making. Hayek has a great paper on this called
Friedrich Hayek,
the use of knowledge in society, where he talks about knowledge being its most potent for the man on the spot, as he called them, like in the context of the time and place in which that knowledge is generated. By the time you pass that knowledge all the way up to the ivory tower and get the commands back, well, things have changed, right? Like, that was the situation a few minutes ago or a few weeks ago, or whatever it may be. So we need to maximize the autonomy of the individuals on the spot. And obviously you can't do that perfectly, but by having these guys that have been in the service and then now their sons are in the service, like, they are bearing the consequences of their decisions, right? Versus externalizing the cost of decisions as we do today, right? Instead of men leading from the front, we have men leading from the back.
Yeah, you're 100% true. And talk about over centralization, that's also a big problem.
Yeah.
I used to see that a lot in some of the intelligence agencies when they become over centralized. Okay, they start to kind of develop this culture where they have a tendency to respond to their incentive structure. And their incentive structure is to look out for the interests only of that agency.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can take information from the field and slant it when they present it to Congress to get to achieve some of their own ends based on what their agendas might be.
Right.
Again, the Romans and the Greeks saw that before it even became an issue.
Yeah.
They had about as decentralized a system as you could have in ancient times. The Romans about got the combination right with the way they ran their legions. That over centralization is definitely a big problem.
Yeah.
I see it a lot.
There's a quote, this was out of Soviet Russia, I think, something like, "It's easy to be a farmer when the nearest agricultural plot is 1,000 miles away and your plow is a pin." When they was it the kulaks? Is that who?
The kulaks, yeah.
Or they said, you farmers don't know what you're doing. We're gonna centrally plan all the agriculture now, and they start writing policies and imposing them, and eventually, well, it was mass starvation. Surprise, surprise! Like, they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Like, they've ever farmed anything, right? They're just sitting in the ivory tower. So yeah, there seems to be a fundamental problem with information flow and incentive breakdown the more you centralize. And this is a lesson that I don't know how many times humanity has to learn it. Like we centralize and then things get bad and then there's some revolution of some sort, things break down and we sort of decentralize again. And then it's just the authors Will Durant and his wife. There's a great book. The title escapes me, but it's a 100-page synopsis of human history, and they describe this tendency to centralize and decentralize back and forth. They call it the systole and diastole of human history, which is like the heartbeat of human history, that we keep doing this over and over and over. Why aren't we learning? Why is it the one thing that we can learn from history is that humans don't learn anything from history? What's wrong? We have short memories. Like
perhaps one element of it is it goes to a wider problem in our education system. We don't really emphasize much in history, or if we teach it, it's something boring like the history of women's corsets and shoes in Victorian era England. It's like, okay, really?
Is that because, I mean, well, at least in this country, education is so state sponsored, to say the least.
There's a lot of issues with it. I'll give you an example. One of the reasons the Roman Empire, one of the main reasons it built itself into this strong power that it was, one, they had skin in the game. They lost that near the end of the 3rd century AD. It's another issue. But they emphasize rigorous study of military history for everybody in their political class and their aristocrat class.
Right.
When they were continuing to improve and build up their legions, they focused not on studying their victories, but their defeats, because that's what you learn the most from.
Yeah.
And in our case, there's a lot of interesting stuff in military history. We don't make it interesting. They make history boring, and there's so much there that we haven't, that the broad population isn't aware of. For example, the collapse of the Roman Empire. The core reason the Roman Empire collapsed, it was one issue. They couldn't get enough citizens to serve in the legions. So give you a quick summary of that if you want me to.
Please.
So near the end of the 3rd century AD, the crisis of the 3rd century was what we historians call it. It was a couple decades of civil war, wars of secession, and a massive plague that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was like a bolt out of the blue. Wiped out about a quarter of the population and about 20-25% of the Roman army. Bad. And then the Gothic invasion started. They came out of that crisis under the leadership of a guy named Emperor Aurelian, who's called Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. He had wiped out a lot of the barbarians that had invaded, driven the Goths out, and got the empire back together. Somewhere around the reign of Diocletian, the Romans had a 72% drop in military recruitment. And we know that through studying things like the Notitia Dignitatum, which is basically centuries of Roman army personnel records. We have the actual records, historians do. That carried through for almost a generation. Stop and think about if the U.S. military had a 72% drop in recruitment and we couldn't reinstate the draft or wouldn't, whatever, after a generation, what does that do to a military? Your NCO corps disintegrates. Your field grade officer corps disintegrates. The ability to take all your lessons, all your sophisticated tactics, combined arms tactics, passing through the lines, artillery, engineering, goes away because you no longer have an NCO corps.
Loss of institutional knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly what happened to the Romans. If you read Vegetius Renatus on Roman military matters, spells it out perfectly. He lived into the end of the Roman Empire and wrote a book that was actually a letter to Emperor Valentinian saying, you got to bring back the old Roman army or we're not going to last. So as time goes on, the 4th century AD, the drop in recruitment starts to look almost like a 90-some-odd% drop. What did that force the Romans to do? It forced them to open their borders to hundreds of thousands of previously hostile barbarian tribes, Alemanni, the Goths, who had finally reproduced enough after their butt whooping by Emperor Aurelian. The Romans brought them in mass number to try to get them to replace their old legions, pay them as kind of like semi-military, semi-mercenaries to fight on their behalf and outsource their military security to them. Those barbarian tribes that were brought in to replace the old Roman legions spent decades ripping the empire apart from the inside out and collaborating with Rome's enemies to tear it down. So imagine if we didn't have two oceans on either side of us. And we had the Taliban over here, drug cartels over here, whatever. And we had a 72, then like a 90% drop in military recruitment. We couldn't replenish the military. Imagine if we opened our borders to let our enemies in to fight in their place, and they ripped us apart from the inside out. That, in a nutshell, is what brought the Romans down and what happened to them. And you may have noticed a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we had the first major drop in military recruitment that we have had since we went to an all-volunteer military. Nobody talked much about it, but if you're a military historian like I am, that is a red star cluster going off saying you better pump the brakes and figure out what the problem is, because this is what brought the Romans down.
Wow. Fascinating stuff. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware's mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few strokes of the keyboard. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your miner's energy bill for the first week of each of your mining rigs when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. All right, I want to segue now into the failed Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yes, sir.
But before I do that, given what we've talked about with intentionality, the inherent deceitfulness in this line of work, it's literally information war, right? You're trying to get information that your opponent doesn't have, and you're trying to not give up information that they don't have and want, right? What is your read on our intention in being in the Iraq war? What was the true intention? Because we as a civilian were told weapons of mass destruction, terror cells, and, you know, after a brief military campaign, we saw a big, I think it was an aircraft carrier with the mission accomplished banner.
Oh, yeah.
And then 20 years, trillions of dollars later, we're still there before the failed Afghanistan withdrawal. What's your read on it? What's your read on the actual intentionality? Like, and when the history books are written 500 years from now, whatever it may be, what will this be called? Was it a petroleum war? Was it like, what was the real, all the way zoomed out geopolitical purpose of this particular armed conflict?
So my last semester at the University of St. Thomas, I had a professor named Dr. Ronald Hatchett. He was an undersecretary of defense in the Reagan administration and the first Bush administration. he knew a lot of the guys we call neocons, Doug Feith, Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney. I think he even knew Rumsfeld. Didn't have too high opinion of some of those guys. These are guys he worked with for a long time. And it seemed that some of these guys, as crazy as it sounds, they may have honestly thought that just by going into Iraq and occupying it and disbanding the Republican Guard, which when we disbanded the Republican Guard, we put like 20,000 military-age males out of a job whose only skill was blowing things up. Gee, I don't know what could go wrong with that. They honestly thought Iraq would become a burgeoning democracy maybe, and that it would spread. Now, they might be the only guys who believe that. There's some evidence that, George W. Bush may have thought, Saddam Hussein supposedly once plotted to kill his father, and that may have ticked him off. That's one possibility. But I can tell you one thing, as far as how they executed it, the incompetence at the strategic level is breathtaking. If the Romans or the Greeks saw how our political class in Washington executed that, they would be going, what are these guys smoking? This isn't how you run an operation. And so it goes back to, not having a clear objective. When you talk to different people at the strategic level, like I did many years later, they each had a completely different idea of what they were trying to accomplish and what they believe. And I'm like, okay, this is a bad sign.
At the strategic level. So where is that fragmentation in objective coming from? Where is the source of the orders that leads to this fragmentation?
The analysis that I'll give, and again, this is my view.
Yeah.
If other people disagree with me, by all means, talk to them as well. I think the core problem, and I make this argument a lot, comes down to what we talked about earlier, no skin in the game. So you have to ask, okay, why weren't our congressmen and senators, White House people, other policymakers, why were they not motivated to sit down, spend a whole night, war game this thing through, and come up with a specific, limited, clear objective that we could go in, as the British used to say, butcher and bolt? The reason I think they were not psychologically motivated to get all these organs of government together, all focused on the same objective, again, they weren't motivated to do so. Why not? No skin in the game. They haven't been to war. If the war gets bad enough, they're not going to have to do like the Romans and the Greeks and put on body armor and go actually fight the barbarians. And they have no sons and daughters that are in any way at risk, right? Now, best way to analyze that from another perspective, I think, is ask yourself this. If we had the ancient Roman military system where all the senators had done 8 years in combat arms, and where by law they would have to put their body armor back on and be a brigade commander or a division commander, like they might be a legatus, a legion commander in ancient Rome, go out there and lead it with their kids at risk. Right. Would these wars have gone as they did?
No way.
Yeah.
Skin in the game, one of the most important concepts in period. Just literally. Okay. One last question. Sorry, just
absolutely.
This is probably not your field, but I have to kind of mix it in there.
Sure.
Another area where skin in the game is notably lacking is in our monetary system.
I don't disagree.
There are a few that can print money and spend money before it is diluted in value through inflation. They can do that ad infinitum, and they externalize all of that cost onto everyone else, which is, the 0.001% printing the money, benefiting from the money, the shareholders of central banks, and then externalizing that cost on the 99.999%. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but have you thought about that connection? Like this deep fundamental lack of skin in the game in the money. And so all of this obviously is funded by, in pursuit of money, all these wars, these intelligence agencies, everything ultimately, well, if there's no money, then there's no business, right? There's no intelligence agency, there's no war. Everything costs money to do. Have you thought about that? Is it possible that the lack of the skin in the game and the money is leading to this centralization and lack of skin in the game everywhere else?
I have thought about that actually. Not as much as I have other things, but from a perspective of skin in the game, I have. So it's going to be oversimplification. In ancient Rome, often when they went to war, the Roman political culture was a warrior political culture. If you wanted to make a political career, you had to do it by having successes in the in the army, the legions, conquering their enemies, destroying their enemies, whatnot. Oftentimes, if there was a military campaign, the Roman senators, if they argued for it, were expected to partially finance it out of their own pockets.
That makes sense.
And if you did too much stupid stuff with debasement of the currency, it did happen a couple of times in Rome.
Towards the end.
Yeah. At the end of the 3rd century, it was becoming a problem in the 3rd century AD. Emperor Aurelian actually stopped it. He went into their treasury. There were corrupt guys in charge. I think he had them crucified. And he broke the treasury up into 4 different areas to try to decentralize a little bit and kind of minimize the corruption. It worked fairly well for a while. But if you do too much of that debasement and printing the money, the Romans knew that would eventually mean that gold and silver you're using to pay for that conquest so you can have your career, if you're a Caesar or a Pompey Magnus or a Crassus, that was going to hit you in the pocketbook. And large elements of our political class, like you said, if the currency's debased, doesn't really hurt them. I mean, think about it. Even if our political class screwed up bad enough to get us into a nuclear war, they got lots of bunkers and stuff they can hide in. So even that nightmare scenario, they're still protected from facing the consequences of their actions.
Decisions.
Whereas the Romans, if you were a senator and you made a mistake, Senator Quintilius Varus, who really did a stupid thing when he walked 3 legions into an ambush in the Teutoburg Forest in Germany in AD 9, based on him trusting his adopted son Arminius, who was a German, a Cherusci, if I'm not mistaken. Well, when he screwed up, he got killed. And when the Romans knew, when they went out to the battle, your senator, you screwed up or made even the smallest mistake, you were going to get killed. So lo and behold, they didn't make near as many mistakes.
They made good decisions. I mean, not to belabor the point, but skin in the game basically being the marriage of actions and consequences of actions, and lack of skin in the game being the divorcing of these two things. It's really contra nature when you think about it, right? Like in nature, well, if the lion trips and doesn't catch the gazelle, well, then the lion's going to go hungry, right? The lion fucked up, the lion goes hungry. If the lion can't trip, miss the gazelle, still eat the gazelle, and then, take the hyenas or something. Like the marriage of actions and consequences is how nature operates. And so we have, in our, high-minded, centralized, institutionalized fashion, we have created incentives and structures that break that. And it's hard. I'm hard pressed to think of a bigger problem than breaking skin in the game. Like it's a great, thank you Taleb for authoring the book.
I was going to say, Nassim Taleb actually talked about the Romans and an emperor named Julian the Apostate.
Yes. And there's so many great examples. Like when, I think it was Roman architects, right? When they would build the aqueducts, right? The great arc, these beautiful arches that support the aqueducts. The architect and his family would stand underneath the aqueduct when the scaffolding was removed, right? So he has a major disincentive to malperformance, right? If you don't architect the thing correctly, well, then you and your family are dead. When banks would go belly up, they would decapitate the banker in front of his bank. Like people were exposed to the consequences of their actions. Surprise, surprise. People acted very prudently and intelligently and conservatively and effectively, ultimately. So I think we should, like in any social system or institution, that should be the primary focus. Like how to maintain skin in the game, which is another way of saying, I guess, like aligning incentives and disincentives.
Well, it's like the no skin in the game thing is interesting with the Romans. A great book to read is called The Fall of the Roman Empire by Michael Grant. He's still one of the world famous experts and renowned historians on ancient Rome. Towards the end of the empire in the 4th century AD, something's happening. They're the Romans are having to put crushing taxes on the middle class and the entrepreneurial business class, where they hadn't really had to do that before. And there's mass tax evasion being done by the aristocrats and the elites, we might call them. So, okay, the Romans always had aristocrats and elites, yet this never happened before. Why are they behaving this way? What you find is when you get to the 4th century AD, with some exceptions, by and large, the Roman political class no longer serving in the army. So if if the army disintegrates, what do they care? So even that, you see how the core problem is still tied together. No skin in the game. I honestly think that the issue of no skin in the game is the core problem our country's facing. For example, you saw how the 2016 election played out. One of the conditions that made that possible was, say, for example, a lot of the outsourcing of industry to communist China, right? Well, if we had the Roman military system, political system, and our senators and congressmen and policymakers had their sons and daughters serving in, say, the Marine Corps and the Navy in the Pacific, I don't think any of that would have happened, because if it's with all that industry going to China, it allows them to build up their military, build capacity to build weapons that are going to now get shot at their kids. If it was their kids at risk in the Pacific, I don't think they would have allowed that to happen. They would have taken steps to stop it from happening, maybe adjusted the regulatory environment that was encouraging that to try to keep them here. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually. A prerequisite for being in the Senate or the House is like your kids need to be in the armed forces somewhere, right? Deployed somewhere.
Well, in World War II, I think all of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's sons, if I'm not mistaken, were serving in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. A lot of congressmen and senators had sons in the military. A lot of their sons got killed.
Yeah.
And I noticed how different that war was fought.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I guess it's been I don't know how long it's been since we withdrew from Afghanistan. A year?
It was August of 2021.
August of 2021. Wow. So it's already been that long. Well, time flies. Why was that such a disastrous withdrawal? What was the original plan, and then what went wrong?
I can give you a little insight into what the original plan was, because I was a part of it on the side. So 2014, they had an election in Afghanistan. It was more or less split between Hamid Karzai and Abdullah. Karzai's a Pashtun, Abdullah Tajik, I think he was Tajik, from the Northern Alliance. Let me just say, the Northern Alliance actually were our allies. They're the guy whose leader, Sheikh Massoud, tried to warn us about 9/11 and paid for it with his life. And we treated them like a bunch of redheaded stepchildren while we tried to suck up to the Pashtuns through the coin, counterinsurgency, hearts and minds stuff. But I digress. Initially, we were considering pulling out in 2014 because the election was chaotic, and we thought Afghanistan was going to collapse into a civil war. We thought they were going to resolve the election like General Dan Bolger said, Chicago Cook County style, and then we would be overlaid on top of it. Oh, wow, it's going to be good for us, right? And so both sides were threatening to kill the other. And we were sending stuff home, sending all of our equipment home, mailing home anything we didn't need. We were told, I think it was by General Dunford, keep everything in just like 1 or 2 bags, have everybody ready to go to get the hell out of here faster than a zit-faced virgin on a Southeast Texas prom night. Okay, that's how fast we were going to have to move out of there. That's putting it lightly. So everybody's moving to places like Bagram and Kandahar. And the way it was averted, I mean, you can't make this stuff up, but I kind of almost got to hand it to Secretary Kerry for pulling this out of his rear, because he did. Those of us in intelligence were watching things closely, communicating with him through various means. And he said, okay, not Hamid Karzai, the guy who replaced him, Ashraf Ghani. I'm sorry, I spoke wrong. It was Ashraf Ghani. He was a Pashtun like Karzai. Sorry, got that wrong. Brain fart.
Oh, sorry. But a lot of names and figures.
I know,
it's okay to have
real. But John Kerry said, look, Ghani, you get to be the president. Abdullah, you can be the CEO of Afghanistan. Yeah. And apparently that stopped them from going to civil war and killing each other, and stopped us from getting caught in the middle. So regardless of what anybody thinks about John Kerry, Mike, say, hey, I don't know where you pulled that out of, dude, but probably averted what could have been an even bigger disaster. Now, when that was happening, we were planning for a last-minute withdrawal. Okay, you got Bagram up here, Kandahar down here. Those airfields are in massive open steppe plains. Okay, it has what we call standoff distance. Okay, you get within 10 miles of there, you'll have a hellfire up your butt so fast it'll make your head spin. If you're going to have a fallback point to get everyone out by air, that makes the most sense because of the standoff distance and the fact that you have massive airfields you can go set up, or that are set up, they can run aircraft out of there real quick. That was what we were originally going to do. So civil war is averted. We go back to running the hamster wheel, right? And President Trump said we were getting out. We ended up staying. President Biden said, no, we will be leaving in 2021. And the commander-in-chief gives you an order like that. Is it incumbent upon you as a professional in the military or the intelligence community to plan for that? When I saw how the withdrawal was being conducted, I was still over in Kosovo. One of the guys who I had worked with, he says, hey, Matt, you got to come see this. I said, what? He says, Matt, they're using Kabul Airport as the fallback point. I said, man, you must have read the Duffel blog or the Onion or something, man. You're ridiculous. There's no way our people are that freaking stupid, because Kabul Airport, tiny area, it's in a city, it's surrounded by buildings and elevated positions. We call that a fire sack ambush. It's about the worst type of ambush you can be caught in modern warfare. You're hit from all sides and all levels. And I can tell you, if you're a sergeant in the Army or Marine Corps and you walk your guys into a fire sack ambush, you'll be lucky if all they do is take your stripes and shit can you. Okay? So it's a big potential fire sack ambush. I'm going, all the Taliban have to do is set up some rockets and some 82 millimeter recoilless rifles and mortars, and it can turn into a damn bloodbath.
This was the official plan.
Well, I don't know if it was, this is what happened.
Okay. Oh, this is what, okay.
This is what ended up happening.
Yeah.
I'm going, guys, I was part of a withdrawal plan years ago. I'm like, that wasn't what we were going to do. Okay. And I thought, okay, it's still got to be a joke. Then I pull it up on the news and I'm like, you got to be shitting me. There's no way that, you know, the generals running CENTCOM can be this stupid. They're former infantry guys. They're part of the same weapons, you know, and training organizations that produced me. And I know these guys know better. They can pretend they don't. No, they knew better. Politicians, I don't always expect them to know better, but you're a general. Hey, dude, you know, you were an infantry lieutenant at one point in time. You know better. I'm thinking, okay, how's this going to play out? And I mean, it was like white knuckle watching the whole thing. Because if I was a member of the Taliban, I could have thought of 50 ways to turn it into a bloodbath. It would not have been difficult. And then come to find out, when that suicide bomber detonated, the rules of engagement that they had our guys under were probably the primary reason that happened. So you remember this came out in congressional testimony a couple years later. There were Marine snipers there who would identify the suicide bomber. They had him in their sights. And our snipers, these guys can hollow out a dime at like 600 yards. They're good. It wasn't anywhere near that far. He's asking his battalion commander, saying, sir, I see the guy. He's obviously got a suicide vest. Can I take the shot? Well, what are the rules of engagement? I don't know. Well, what if we fire into a crowd? It's like, dude, he's a sniper. I mean, it's possible one innocent person could have gotten hit if it went through his head. Yeah, but what's the alternative kind of thing? Kept asking for permission to fire. And this was in an area, I can't remember what the gate was called, but I'd driven through it a bunch of times. Now, when I was in the Marine Corps, I was an anti-tank assault man. I mean, I did a lot with it, with anti-armor warfare, anti-tank, and explosives and demolitions. That area had a lot of concrete walling on either side. I can't remember how long it went. But what that does is if a bomb goes off, it'll channel the explosion a certain direction. In this case, right into our guys. So he's asking for permission. Rules of engagement say they can't shoot because they don't want to have, quote, civilian casualties. And then that son of a bitch blows himself up. Killed like 13 of our guys and killed God knows how many women and children who were standing around him. So the very rules of engagement that were supposed to, quote, preserve civilian life just got a bunch of them killed. And I saw that happen. And I thought to myself, you know, even our withdrawal from Vietnam was not this incompetent. I mean, I used to think that was like the the epitome of incompetence, how we executed the war in Vietnam, what we did there. I'm going, it's like the Twilight Zone. I can't believe I'm seeing this. And we finally pulled out, and make no mistake about it, there were some good folks in Afghanistan who did risk their lives and their families to help us. Paid dearly for it. And we abandoned them and said, fuck you, we don't need you anymore. I remember seeing that. And most of the soldiers who were at Bondsteel were newer guys. They didn't have a combat patch, hadn't been over there. But they said, hey, Matt, are you okay, dude? And I was like, I'm going to go to Skopje, Macedonia this weekend and do some drinking like I haven't done in a long ass time. 'Cause I knew some of these people. And I thought about that, and I'm thinking to myself, could we at least not have just, done it better and gotten those people? I know we could have done it. And so I saw that, and a whole lot of things are going through my head. There's the military history thoughts, knowing the Romans would not have run an operation this incompetent. Certainly not the Greeks. And I'm just thinking to myself, I can't believe this is happening. And so I went back. I thought friends of mine who were killed, guys I served with who were wounded. One good friend of mine lost both his legs in a IED explosion just north of Fob Moscow, which is where I was when I was in Afghanistan. He blew his brains out with a 12 gauge a few years later. Left behind a wife and a bunch of kids. I thought about all that, and we had some senior ranking people who were there at Bondsteel. Colonel Hopkins was a good man. He brought those of us together who had been to Afghanistan. He said, guys, I know this is hard. And I said, sir, if I don't walk away from what I'm seeing on television right now, with some of these senior ranking people, if they come by, I'm going to say something I'm going to regret. Maybe it's best that I just go be by myself, leave work a little early Friday. And he was a good man, all where they said, you need to take some time, some time off to be by yourself, just go. I'm like, that was nice of him to do. And I thought about all that, all the blood and the waste, all the guys we lost, a lot of our conventional fighting skills that we may need in the future degraded substantially. We're still struggling to get those back. Bringing in retired NCOs is, I think, how the Army's doing it. And I thought to myself, if we had gone to war with Russia and China right after all this, whole lot more people would have gotten killed than would have been, than would have normally happened or been absolutely necessary. And I thought to myself, looking at some of our policymakers in D.C., and I've met some of them, they're not all bad people. Some of them want to fix the problem, they don't know how to do it. And if the problem, like you say, is no skin in the game, well, how do you fix that, right? So I thought about it. The people who got us jammed into here with no clear objective, they had us under rules of engagement that I swear were designed to get us killed. And I thought to myself, how the hell do these people sleep at night? If I was one of them, I'd be thinking about starting a 12 gauge, I couldn't live with myself if I was one of those people up top. And when I looked at all that, and I was down there in Macedonia, drinking quite a bit. I'm not the type of person who likes to get drunk, but I definitely needed a hard buzz, or I was just going to go nuts. I tell you what kind of frame of mind I was in. I called a Marine recruiter back in Houston. Marine Corps, if you come back in, they don't make you go back through boot camp again. They'll let you come back in at whatever rank you were. I said, hey, we hadn't completely gotten out of Afghanistan yet. I said, hey, told the recruiter, I was like, I can pass a PFT, physical fitness test, with a high first class for my age group. Can I come back in for a couple years? If y'all are going to go back into Afghanistan to retaliate, I'll fly back to Houston right now if you can guarantee me a slot. Give me an M16. I will go and jack some shit up. And he said, Mr. Reed, you're too old. He says, but I want you to know, you trying to do this just motivated the hell out of me. And he says, I don't know what I can tell you to make the pain go away, as I feel the same way. And as I'm as I'm sitting there in Skopje, Macedonia, I remember right where I was sitting was at the Marriott there in the city center. It's by I think it's the Alexander the Great statue they got. There's a pretty cool looking statue. But I started thinking, I just sat there for hours, all these thoughts going through, and I started thinking about all the hundreds and hundreds of military history books I've read, the Greeks, the Romans. And that was when it finally got into my head. I know how this thing got so fucked up. And I thought, okay, I know what the problem is. I know what the solution would be, and yet I have no earthly idea how to make it happen. And one of the reasons I talked about this, like here, and then another podcast I did, the Cleared Hot podcast with SEAL Commander Andy Stump in 2022, is I see how bad a lot of the political division is in the U.S. I see what people are saying to each other. It breaks my freaking heart. Thinking about Afghanistan and everything that happened. And I want people who are watching this, I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, left or right. Most of the things that I think people are fighting over are just symptoms of that core problem, no skin in the game. The outsourcing of jobs to China that hurt so many Americans. If we had the Roman system like we discussed before, most likely wouldn't have happened. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan would not have drug on and caused so much political division. We would have had a clear objective, done like the Romans did under Emperor Trajan when they hit and invaded Mesopotamia in I think it was 116 AD. Go in hard, fast, hit what you got to hit, kill as many as you can, and get the hell out. They would have been something, the objectives would have been successful. We would have killed who we wanted to kill, bin Laden, Mullah Muhammad Omar, got the hell out. There wouldn't have been all that political division that came up later. And so when I see people on the left and the right arguing and saying horrible things to each other, none of which are true. And I think, guys, you're hating each other when you don't need to. What you need to hate is this core problem and no skin in the game. You want to do the right thing. Stop attacking each other. Stop calling, voters on the left a bunch of stupid communists. Stop calling the voters on the right a bunch of morons or, racists or whatever. I know there's knuckleheads on each side of the political aisle, no doubt about it. The broad spectrum of people on either side are not like that. And so if you're a young person watching this now, okay, your parents' generation made a lot of mistakes. They can't do anything to fix that now. If you want to focus on fixing this issue, this core problem of no skin in the game, that will solve about 90% of the country's problems right off the top. You want to fix it, this is how you do it. Look at how the Greeks and the Romans had their societies set up. And you're not going to fix the problem by just, hurling insults at each other on social media or whatever. And our enemies in Moscow and Beijing, that is what those sons of bitches want. I can tell you that for a fact. They see Americans attacking each other. It's what these assholes want. They want to watch us destroy ourselves. Stop playing their freaking game. If there are people in our own financial community somewhere who run these news networks that like to keep us divided and make money, you hate those guys? Well, you're playing their game. So I tell people, take a deep breath, go read and study your history, look at it from the perspective of what happens when you don't have skin in the game, and you can see what the primary core problem is, and that everything that these people are fighting over is a symptom of that problem.
Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-key vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control over your keys. Your funds are fully auditable on-chain, cannot be rehypothecated, and can only move or be withdrawn at your explicit direction. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. Bitcoin is money, and as the price continues to appreciate, OnRamp helps you seamlessly tap into financial services like trading, inheritance, insurance, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security or accessibility. Schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team to learn more at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. As one of my business mentors once told me, the job of the boss is to eliminate confusion. The best antidote for confusion is access to truth, which brings clarity to business decision-making and thus optimizes the drive toward future business goals. Over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP system, which brings accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make decisions quickly and effectively. If I was still a CFO, NetSuite is undoubtedly the ERP system I would use in my business. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, you can download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/whatismoney. This guide is packed with useful insights and is free for you at netsuite.com/whatismoney. Again, that's netsuite.com/whatismoney. I don't want to be the hammer looking at everything like it's a nail, but you are on the What is Money show.
Sure.
The #1 area of skin in the game being broken, the most important area is, as I said earlier, appears to be the money. So for instance, between 2001 and 2020, this is before we printed $8 trillion post-pandemic, and you could fact check me on this, but I think we printed $2.5 trillion in that period of time. The war on terror, quote unquote war on terror, I don't really think it's a war. It's, much more like the way you've been describing it. I think the total cost of the war on terror was around $2.1 trillion.
That sounds about right.
Now,
It's probably higher.
My numbers might be off, but it was the amount of money printed was very closely correlated to the amount of money spent on the war on terror, right? So the war couldn't have happened, basically. And when you run those numbers back,
Sure.
You say, okay, had we not had the money printer as a means of funding the war on terror, how would we have funded it? Well, you would send that tax bill to U.S. households.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah.
And it came
exactly,
to a staggering, it was like $80,000 per U.S. household. So you could imagine how much resistance there would have been
Absolutely.
had every U.S. household received a bill from Uncle Sam saying, hey, you owe us 80 grand because we're blowing up brown people on the other side of the planet. People would say, fuck you, right? There'd be riots in the streets. They just wouldn't pay it.
Well, it's like the concept of skin in the game. So you actually illustrated it perfectly. If we were not able to print all that money and debase our currency, if we wanted to fight a long, protracted war, we'd have to transfer that cost directly to the wallets of American taxpayers and
Yes.
American households. And people would have said, whoa, what the hell's going on here? As it is, that money printing you described, that facilitated encouraging the American people to turn a blind eye to some really bad, destructive behavior on our part that's going to eventually, it's biting us in the butt now. It's going to bite us harder in the future, I'm sure. But it does come back down to no skin in the game. I mean,
So that's what I wanted to ask you. Sorry to interrupt, but
Sure, no, go ahead.
Bitcoiners often say, fix the money, fix the world. And I think this is basically the problem they're getting at. It's like, hey, the skin in the game and the money is not there. So therefore you get these really perverse consequences, right? Like, again, that 0.0001% of people that can print money. Well, if you can print money, you can print anything that money can buy, right? So that includes media organizations, influence. You can manufacture entire narratives, right? You can propagandize and possibly even psychologically operate on large populations. So when you say reinstate or I don't know, bring back skin in the game. I don't know if it was bringing it back. I mean, sort of, I don't know if we ever had it. I'm not sure. Implementing skin in the game specifically, like, is there something other than the money that you're speaking about specifically? Like, what other things should we be thinking about in terms of fixing skin in the game in society to resolve these problems?
So going back to the ancient Roman military system, this is where you get a little bit deeper, but it'll make sense when people stop and think about it. When the political class serving in the military and their kids, they're alongside the sons and daughters, in our case.
Oh, yes, of course,
daughters.
of course.
They're alongside the sons and daughters of the middle class and the poor class, whether it's middle class people, entrepreneurs, small business owners, or shopkeepers, farmers, rural populations, or inner city populations. The senators and their kids are serving alongside them. So the well-being of that population becomes critical to you because you know you need them to provide recruits and be willing to fight alongside you. And to win wars, you have to have guys willing to go the extra mile. Okay? Whether that's through desire, training, esprit de corps, whatever. So the types of things that would cause real horrifying harm to that population, like financial harm, you're going to have a vested interest in either making sure it doesn't happen or trying to keep it to a minimum when it does happen from out of the blue. At the end of the day, if we had that system, hypothetically, you've heard of fraggings.
It's an explosive.
Vietnam, if they had a leader who was a real asshole or who was stupid, they'd roll a grenade in his hooch or shoot him in the back in a firefight.
Oh, wow.
If you're a policymaker, let's say maybe you're the chairman of the Federal Reserve, you got two sons that say are serving as infantry officers in the Army or the Marine Corps. You know they're serving alongside people from the rural South, the inner cities, business, middle class, whatever. If you realize you're engaging in a policy that's going to hurt their family, your sons can have a grenade rolled into their hooch or get shot in the back, and you're going to know that. And that's going to be something they have to figure into their thinking. So it would act as, it would completely fix all the financial stuff, but on some really destructive stuff that has been done, it would definitely motivate the policymakers to put the brakes on it real quick when it starts to happen.
Right.
And if it's one of those rare situations where they're in a bind, they have to do something bad for a little while, like Marcus Aurelius when he became emperor. There was a plague, they call it the Anodyne Plague. If you watch Gladiator and they say, have you ever embraced someone dying of plague side? This is what that Roman senator was telling Commodus, Joaquin Phoenix's character about. Marcus Aurelius had to deal with a plague that killed off a chunk of their army in the north, and the barbarians came at them hard. Now, the Romans retaliated and, more or less beat them like a $2 hooker on half-price coupon night over a long period of time. I mean, did a number on them.
You Texans and your fucking idioms. So good.
And so he pushed them out. There were migrating tribes of barbarians from Central Asia that fought a little bit like the Mongols. He had wiped them out. But because it was an emergency and a lot of people had died, he had to increase taxes. And for a little while, there was some debasement of the currency to fund the army. But Marcus Aurelius, all his possessions and wealth, he gave to the Roman state to help fund the army. And he says, hey, I cannot ask Roman citizens to endure that financial strain if I'm not willing to at least give up all my gold and silver and my statues myself.
Wow.
And while it did happen, when it was no longer necessary, he stopped it. Cassius Dio, I think, may give us some insight into that. He was a former Roman army officer who was a senator who wrote about Marcus Aurelius. So while they did it for a little while, the elites, because of the way their system was structured, and they could debase the currency, but not without it hitting them as well.
Yeah.
You could smack them pretty hard because of the way things were. And so that skin in the game and knowing that any financial strain they put on the middle class and the poor, knowing when you're going into battle against, say, the Marcomanni or the Sarmatians, Who's on either side of you if you're a Roman tribune whose dad's a senator? Poor and the middle class. Your dad might be the legion commander swinging a sword next to those guys. That's where the soldiers and the centurions are coming from. He's going to think, do I really want to go out of my way to financially wreck their families, knowing their kids could knife me in the back in the middle of battle, or in our case, shoot them in the back? It would definitely provide an incentive for them to do things differently.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. Yeah, that again, we've fallen so far from that, right? Okay, is there anything else on Afghanistan? I mean, like, I guess we don't know why, right? We don't know. We don't know the intention behind the failure, or we don't know if it's incompetence or.
It was, from what I saw, again, just my perspective. Initially, going in to kill bin Laden, Mullah Muhammad Omar, wipe out the Al-Qaeda networks there. It looks like initially that is what we were doing because of the way the military operations were being run. And then, of course, we took our eye off the ball, went over to Iraq, and we had what some people call mission creep and strategic drift when you don't have a clear objective. And so this is where things get a little more complicated. They would take polls back in the U.S. Do you think we should leave Afghanistan? Americans say, oh, I'm scared we might get attacked if we leave. Politicians hear that and say, how can I get their vote? I'll keep us in Afghanistan. There's one element. Also, having no skin in the game makes that easy. And so then after a while, they realized the American people
had they received the bill,
yes,
they would not have voted that way. Yeah.
If they said, hey, we're going to be here for 20 some odd years trying to rebuild this place, what's there to rebuild? There was nothing there, not much there to begin with. It's going to take 20 or 25 years, cost trillions of dollars, and it's probably not going to work. But we're going to bill each of your households $80,000 to do it, so we can make a nice village for Mrs. Mohammed or whoever. You said that to American households, you'd have gotten a completely different reaction
For sure.
And that being able to print money to that level for that long a period of time, the way we did, it wasn't like in World War II. In World War II, they increased taxes. They had rationing.
Yeah, bonds too.
Bonds, war bonds. They had women went to work in the factories when the men went off to war. And there was skin in the game in World War II. In a lot of the wars America's fought, there were always a portion of our political class and wealthy families, the Vanderbilts and even the Rockefellers, their kids would go and become officers, either naval intelligence, army intelligence. And so some of that was there. A good example is Eleanor Roosevelt. She really was a remarkable woman. When her kids were going off to war as first lady, she could have stopped them from being sent off to war if she wanted to. And though it broke her heart, she didn't. She's like, I cannot ask 12 million other American mothers to do this if I'm not willing to do it myself. And she told Democrats something. She said, if you want to be successful, she says, don't ever ask your constituents to do something you're not willing to do.
That's that leading from the front thing again. It's not just literal leading from the front lines, but also figurative. In Marcus Aurelius giving up his possessions before they taxed the population, Eleanor Roosevelt agreeing to send her children to war before asking other Americans to do it. That leading from the front thing, also very important here. I guess it's a restatement of skin in the game, but it was just occurring to me that there's more than one way to lead from the front.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's just like the Marine Corps would say, ductus exemplo, Latin, lead by example. And we still had that in Korea. Alan Dulles, the CIA director at the time, his son, Alan Macy Dulles Jr., was a Marine infantry officer in Korea, got a piece of his brain blown out. He had to go through the VA like everybody else. Now, the VA hospital he went through wasn't quite as jacked up as the other ones because when his son had a problem, his daddy could take it straight to President Eisenhower. And whoever was in charge of the VA would be maybe marched in by the Marine Guards, and you really didn't want to test a guy like Ike. But it goes to not having skin in the game. And then when you look at dichotomy between World War II and Vietnam, World War II, a lot, not all, but a lot of our political class had skin in the game. Most Americans had skin in the game. Vietnam, now they did have the draft, so a lot of the population had skin in the game. And of course, that war was resisted and eventually stopped.
Yeah.
But the political class, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and those knuckleheads, no skin in the game. And of course, clear objective in World War II, no clear objective in Vietnam. World War II success, Vietnam disaster.
Man, let's shift into the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Outstanding.
Obviously, this is, I mean, I don't know, is it ongoing? Or what's the current status of it? I guess we should just maybe...
So current status...
as of January 2025, when we're recording this.
So the Russians are still coming at the Ukrainians pretty hard. Now, you hear how the Russians are doing things, these, quote, meat attacks, where they just throw guys into the breach. I don't think that's 100% accurate. You examine it a little further, there's a little method to the Russian madness. You have to understand how the Russian military thinks. So we tend to think of the Russians as just throwing mass number and overwhelming it like an army advance, right? The reason we have that perspective is, I'm going to digress a bit here, but I'll tie it together. So after World War II, we realized we may have to fight the Russians. The only source of information we had were the Germans and the German generals who had fought the Russians. Now, the German generals, upclass, Prussian, Western Europeans, very sophisticated, you know. They thought, how could we ever be outsmarted by these vile, inferior Slavs? They're just animals. I think to myself, okay, not so fast. So here's what the Russians will actually do. They'll use a numerical advantage, but not in the way people think. They'll use a large number of troops with a little bit of armored firepower to not try to overwhelm. They hit and they attack, but they're not just throwing troops away. They're looking for a weakness. The way their intelligence structure is built at the tactical level is to identify when they push and probe where the actual weakness is, then suck everything up, pull it around, and then barrel through with everything they got.
Oh, okay.
That's what they're actually trying to do. It's what they did to the Germans. They had a different way of doing it at Stalingrad. They suckered them in, Friedrich von Paulus and the German Sixth Army. But when they encircled them, they used that same technique, but here's the thing. There were two segments of the German lines. A small number of German and SS troops and a large number of Italian and Hungarian troops. But where do you think the weak part in the line really was? With the foreign conscripts, some of whom were basically slaves. They encircled them. What it looks to me like they're trying to do in the Ukraine is they're throwing a lot of convicts and prisoners out of their jails. Man, that's a good way to get rid of them, you know, save you a lot of money.
Wow.
But it's forced the Ukrainians to burn up ammo. But they're throwing them in so many different directions, the Ukrainians can't always tell where the main attack might come from. So it kind of confuses your ability to analyze the tactical situation. And so they're doing that while they're trying to move their troops around. They're trying to do an encirclement. But fortunately for, you know, us and NATO, a lot of the Ukrainian officers served in the Red Army. So they know that trick. And they're being pretty adept at pulling their forces back and stopping that from happening. That's kind of the jousting that's going on now. Now, you know, people may ask, why is this happening? Right? Yeah, people say different things. Some people on one part of the political spectrum are saying it's because we were mean to Putin. Someone else is saying because he's an evil asshole, yada, yada, yada. You can technically find the roots of this probably going all the way back to when the Romans conquered Greece. That could take a long time, but so go back not quite as far. Western Roman Empire collapses. You got the Eastern Roman Empire over here. Christian, we call it the Byzantine Empire. They survived for a long time, a lot of different reasons. Victor Davis Hanson had a good analysis of that in one of his books. But around the 10th century AD, a Russian prince...
I'll just throw in there that they went back to sound money, which has contributed to the Byzantine Empire, contributed to its longevity.
Oh, they did. They had pretty good monetary policy. They were pretty good about that. You're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt, though.
No worries. So around the 10th century AD, a guy named Prince Vladimir, I can't, it was in the 900 AD. I can't remember the exact date. A little rusty on that one. Makes contact with the Byzantine Empire and agrees to adopt Christianity, or what was Catholicism then. Okay. And that spreads throughout Russia. Then in 1054, you have something called the Great Schism of 1054, where you have a bifurcation between the Latin Roman Catholic Church that speaks Latin and then what we now call Eastern Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox Church. They break. And I posed the question at St. Thomas, could the roots of that have gone back to when the Romans conquered Greece? Because the Greeks always resented the hell out of being conquered by the Romans. That's clear if you read the history up to a certain point. So that happens, and so you've already got a religious split, okay? And then you have the fall of Constantinople. The Turks blow it up. The Catholic Church didn't seem like it did much to help them out. The Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox thought the Catholic Church backed away on purpose to try to teach us a lesson. That's how they interpret it. I don't know if that's right. That's how they looked at it. And so the Russians, you have a separation now. You've already got different language, different ethnic group, totally different geography. Now you've got a religious split. Okay, this is part of the reason why the Russians never pulled close to the West, like you might have thought they were going to do when they adopted Christianity. And so as time goes on, you've got Byzantine Empire here, rest of Europe over here, the Muslim world down here. Muslim world was originally much more technologically sophisticated than the Europeans were. Okay, the Muslims had surgical anesthetics like the Romans did. If you had a headache in the Muslim world, they'd give you medicine or essential oils to relax the muscles. Whereas in medieval Europe, they drill a hole in your head and pour salt in your brains. They thought you had a demon. I guess salt kills demons or something. Well, you got to ask yourself, okay, what happened? How does it all tie together? So you had a fundamental debate going on in the Muslim world and Christendom, religion versus science. Religion won the debate in the Islamic world because of some guys like Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Ghazali, who I believe convinced Arabs that the manipulation of numbers like algebra was like satanic. In Europe, you have the Protestant Reformation. What that does, it blows the door open to scientific advancement and innovation. And in some cases, rediscovering the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans. The Romans and the Greeks knew the earth was round, and they had the circumference almost exactly the way it was.
It's that statue of Trajan, right? Yeah. Holding the round earth.
I think it's Trajan, yeah. Rediscovering all that. And science starts to advance at a dramatic pace in Europe. Okay, the Europeans, of course, developed deep water navigation because they want to get around dealing with the Muslim world when they trade with India and China. You get Christopher Columbus, all that. And then you have the Peace of Westphalia in 1619, which kind of founds the modern-day nation state, right? And then you have the Pilgrims come to America, the Spaniards before that in Latin America spreading Catholicism. Technology starts to advance. Then you have the Industrial Revolution type technologies. But here's the problem. Most European countries were very, very poor in the resources they needed to support that kind of economic development for their citizens. So what do? They built traditional empires to go out and get commodities and resources at below market prices. The Dutch did, the French did, the British did, the French did. French ended up not being too successful because they didn't have a clear policy and they didn't give clear objectives, so they just wafted from one disaster to the next. Who's that sound like? The British had clear strategy, clear policy, and their entire military policy in the 19th century at the height of their empire was 3 words: butcher and bolt. They didn't want to get bogged down in occupation. Well, they got to get those resources, and those European countries end up fighting over the resources. Russia, however, resource rich. Some cases not too hard to get to if you're already there. So that plays a role. The Europeans fight over a lot of that stuff, and the Russians start to face a lot of invasions and Napoleonic wars. Then you get to World War II. This is where it really kicks into high gear. The Germans threw 3 million regular Army Wehrmacht troops and SS troops at the Russians, and they almost had them. They got pretty close to Moscow. The Russians did what they usually did. They let them come in deep and then tried encirclements. Now, we helped the Russians out. We gave them like 476,000 Studebaker trucks. We actually uprooted factories and shipped them piece by piece across the Arctic Circle, moved them down to Russia. Yeah. Of course, the Russians had plenty of slave labor. I wonder where they got that from. And so we set up factories there, and it filled or it stopped the vulnerability the Russians had always had for the distance they have to fight under. Logistics, that's still Russia's one of their primary weak points, and we're seeing that in the Ukraine war, where they only had 2 rail lines, and the Ukrainians cut them. The Russians were like, "Oh, comrade, what do we do now?" You know, so we patched that vulnerability. When we did that, Heinz Guderian, one of the German generals who was one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, said, Gott mein Himmel, my God, the Americans have mechanized the Slav. He knew that was going to be pretty significant. The Germans might be in trouble. So Russians beat the Germans. They wipe out the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. They do encirclements in places like Kursk, which is where they're fighting over now, the famous tank battle there. And as they go through, they trick the Germans through a counterintelligence operation. So this is what they did. The Russians paired their counterintelligence, disinformation, and double agent operations at the strategic level all the way down to the tactical level. Here's what they did. So initially, the best source of intelligence the Germans had were Russian soldiers who surrendered. So here's what the Russians did. They sent SMERSH, that was their military counterintel organization, and NKVD agents out to pretend to surrender. And when they did, they'd ambush the German soldiers. So then the Germans said, from now on, when a Russian surrenders, shoot the bastard. As far as the Russians are concerned, that gets rid of traitors, and it stops their source of human intelligence. The Germans didn't realize they'd gotten played till a little while later. So there was that. And then the Russians had 5 spies in Britain. Burgess, McLean, Blunt, Philby, and Cairncross, I think. They were called the Cambridge Five. They've been Russian assets for a long time. And they were giving the Russians really good military intelligence on German weapon systems. The Germans, because they weren't stupid and they were good at analyzing numbers in detail, realized that must be the case. What the Russians did, they had assets in the German government who fed disinformation to German army intelligence, the Abwehr run by Reinhard Gehlen, convinced them that some of these German generals were the spies. They killed those generals thinking they got rid of the spies when, in fact, the Russians were getting it from these 5 Brits that they had recruited and blackmailed. So World War II's over with, okay? We're on one side with the British, Red Army on the other. We look at the Red Army, we're like, oh, shit. These guys look like they're no joke. What if we have to fight them? What do we do? So we created an alliance structure. What we did, we told the Europeans, look, half the reason this war happened is you idiots had to fight over empires in Africa and India, wherever else. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use our Navy, now global in nature, to secure all the world's shipping and sea lanes, and we wiped out piracy. We will build the empire for you. Our Navy will maintain an empire for you, and then we will ensure the supply of oil coming from the Middle East and other places that are resource rich to build up your economies, power your economies so you can build a military to help us hold back the Russians. Okay? As one British general said, the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down.
Wow.
So there was a gentleman's agreement in 1947 with us and the old men in the Kremlin, basically, hey guys, we'll make sure the Germans don't get too powerful. You want to take Czechoslovakia and Hungary, go ahead. But the line stops there, and the Russians are like, okay, comrade, maybe we live with this, whatever. So that kind of is how things shake out by 1947 to about 1950, I think, when they had the Bretton Woods Agreement. That was the basis for it, was the Europeans don't have to build empires to take in resources they don't have at home because we're going to secure the sea lanes for them. In exchange for that, then the South Koreans, the Japanese, hold back the communists, hold back the Red Army. Okay?
Same agreement that pegged the U.S. dollar to gold and every other currency to the U.S. dollar, giving us financial dominance.
Yes.
Yeah. One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. Knowing when to buy Bitcoin can feel complicated, and knowing how much to buy can be overwhelming, and getting started can be a headache, but it doesn't have to be. That's exactly why I recommend Coinbits, because it solves these major blockers and it's the easiest way to buy Bitcoin. With Coinbits' Roundups feature, you can automatically convert your spare change into Bitcoin while you shop. For example, when you buy a coffee for $3.50, the extra 50 cents is rounded up and it goes straight into Bitcoin. Here's why that's a huge win for you, because you don't have to be a tech wizard or try to time the market just right with Bitcoin. With Coinbits Roundups, you simply set it, shop, and stack sats. And you can set this up in under 2 minutes. Just visit the website, connect your card, and boom, you're buying a little Bitcoin every time you spend money. So stop wasting your time with complicated exchanges or confusing shitcoin apps. Coinbits simplifies your Bitcoin savings strategy. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove. Again, that's coinbits.app/breedlove.
Cold War goes through. Things heat up a bit in the 70s because the West is going to have a crash program to go to nuclear power generation for electricity.
Mm-hmm.
That could cripple the Russians because the only export the commies could actually make money off of is oil and gas exports.
Mm-hmm.
So if most of the countries in the West, us, France, Germany, Canada, and maybe Japan, if we had gone to full nuclear power generation for electricity, that could have crippled them. They knew that. So that whole anti-nuclear power movement, a lot of that was a Russian KGB operation.
Wow.
Okay, that's no secret now. They've admitted to that. But the only place where it didn't succeed was France because French counterintelligence was so freaking ruthless. That's why the French are so big, have a lot of nuclear power infrastructure. It's well built. So Ronald Reagan, of course, comes in and wins the 1980 election, becomes president in 1981, and we decide we're going to push the Russians. We had a big military buildup to try to deter them from doing anything conventionally, and then we worked with the Saudis to crash oil prices.
Yeah.
That was a crippling economic blow against the Russians. Cold War ends, 91, 92, it collapses. Yay, happy days are here again. And not so fast. We noticed, and the Rand Corporation did a study on this, I think in 1993, the Russians had a 60% drop in birth rate like that after the Cold War. 60%. And one of their primary exports were beautiful young Russian girls who were either came out as mail order brides, refugees trying to get away. You can't blame them there. Or millions of Russian girls being trafficked out by the Russian mob as prostitutes, sex slaves to work the brothels in Europe. Wow. Europeans didn't care because all those good-looking hookers gave them more tax revenue to collect when they got more of them.
Wow.
Now,
why the collapse in birth rate? Sorry.
A whole lot. Why is...
If it's a tangent, don't worry about it. I was just curious.
It would be a really extensive tangent. A lot of things. Alcoholism, they have an AIDS epidemic worse than ours. For decades, because their medical system collapsed. I mean, it was a socialist system, so of course it was crappy, but it did kind of functional to keep people alive. Yeah,
okay.
That's gone. So population, or massive birth rate collapse. Now,
economic conditions must have deteriorated.
Oh, drastically.
So that'll do it too.
That was a big part of it too.
Yeah.
So all your females who could be having babies are working as hookers or becoming mail order brides in Canada, Mexico, Britain, Australia, millions of them. Take that, combine it with the collapsing birth rate, run this forward 2 generations, what does that do? You're dying off. So You get to a point now, a lot of Russian girls, Jim Mattis actually talked about this in front of Congress. A lot of Russian girls are using abortions as a cheap form of birth control, which eventually damages your ability to carry a baby to term. It's horrible. So the Russians are dying off. Now, because of their history and all the invasions they face, the Russians have it seared into their minds they must control Eastern and Central Europe to stop invasion. It's just seared into their brains. If they're going to do that, first they got to take Ukraine, and their population die-off, demographic collapse right now is such that by like the middle to later part of this century, the Russian race will eventually basically died off. It'll be nothing but a bunch of old Slavs like 50 and 60 years old. Okay?
Really?
Yeah. So,
Wow.
yeah, Peter Zeihan, geopolitical analyst, did some really good analysis on this. We've used it in the intelligence community. So stop and think about this for a second. So if that's your mentality, you know your population's dying off. A decade from now, the Russians may not be able to field an army even half the size of the one they have now. Something else Peter Zeihan's analysis more or less showed. So if they're going to secure their near abroad with the military, they have to do it now. That was the argument I made in Kosovo when I said, no, the Russians are coming. Oh, no, it's just bluster. It'll be too bloody. I'm like, you're thinking like an American.
Right.
This is a Russian you're dealing with Putin. So there's that. But here's what nobody thinks about. When President Trump was talking about, I don't know if he's going to actually do, but pulling out of NATO if they didn't make their 2%, which Europeans agreed to make 2% GDP, and they weren't doing it. So they kind of had to get taken to task for that. Well, here's what no one's thinking about. When the Russians do start to die off, and that is pretty much inevitable at this point, and they can't, and most of their population's over the age of 55 and 60, they don't have an army, which means no army, no security services. What happens to those 10,000 nuclear weapons they have? They're literally up for grabs. So if we want to make sure that when they die off, those 10,000 nuclear weapons they got don't end up all over the planet with every swinging dick who's got a grudge against someone, we've got to maintain that NATO alliance in Eastern Europe. And now you notice we're moving things into Scandinavia. When the Russians die off, us and our allies have got to be able to go in there and grab up those damn nukes. That is one of the biggest national security problems facing us. And so when they talk about there being some tension in the intelligence community between President Trump and a lot of our mid-level and some senior-level folks, that was one of the sources of it, because coming in from the outside in the business world, which there's nothing wrong with that, that wasn't something that Trump would have necessarily been aware of. It wasn't something that, until he became president and they said, hey, here's what's going on, he probably just didn't know that. That's why there was some head-butting and tension there. So that's why we still maintain the NATO alliance. It's to prevent nuclear weapons trafficking. And so to boil it down to its, most basic point, when that happens, probably by 2050, 2060, depending on which numbers you're using, you can grab up and stop those nuclear weapons 7,000 miles away in conjunction with our allies in Europe, or you can try to stop them at the border with Mexico.
So when you say that happens, this is another collapse of the Russian state, kind of like the collapse of the USSR? Like, what is that event?
This is this is literally a population die-off. This is the Russian state collapsing and the Russian ethnicity going the way of the dodo bird.
But it's not going to be instant, obviously.
It'll take probably about, like I say, about 2050, 2060.
And wouldn't it stop declining at some point? Like, wouldn't the population reach some stable minimum and start to maybe grow even again? Or like,
well, you would think, but one, you got to think about the fact they are very much a totalitarian police state. So, and because their state doesn't have anywhere near as much control over the population as the Soviet Union did, so lots and lots of people have been getting up and just leaving.
Right.
So that's a big part. That's one of the reasons why they haven't been able to reverse it. Now, that issue with nuclear weapons trafficking and possible nuclear detonations does get a little bit into the UFO topic.
That's where we're going next.
Okay, I gotta be extremely careful what I say, but I'll still give some perspective on it. So, can't go into too much detail about what I know about what these things are, what I've seen. I have seen some stuff at certain levels. I have seen stuff at the TSSCI level I can never talk about. I take it to the grave with me probably. But you notice this is with open source information. UFO sightings explode after we detonated the atomic bomb at Trinity.
And when was that?
That was in 1945.
Okay, this is the Oppenheimer movie.
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah.
Then Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then there's a much bigger explosion in these UFO sightings around military and nuclear test sites, starting around like 1952, but continuing for a long time. In 52 is when we detonated what was called the Teller-Ulam device, or the hydrogen bomb. Edward Teller's, baby, grandchild, whatever you want to call it. And so that's an interesting thing to look at. Here's something I can tell you to give people something to think about. When I was in Afghanistan, I worked with a guy who had been a missile defense officer. I think he was a Patriot missile battery commander. And he had gone through the missile defense school at White Sands, New Mexico, where the guys who also do the THAAD, which is the missile that goes out in space and knocks stuff down. There's an old Army colonel there who had been out to places like Area 51. This is Adam telling me this. I didn't hear this myself. Adam says, they asked the colonel, hey, it's all that shit about aliens and all this other stuff, Colonel, is that true? The colonel doesn't laugh. Takes a pull of his whiskey, puts it down, looks right at Adam, and he says, son, let me ask you something. Imagine you're a group of mariners or sailors plying the world's oceans. You see a primitive island over here with what you think are a bunch of nutless, hairless monkeys or whatever. Then all of a sudden, you see flares and missiles flying out of those islands. You going to want to go down and have a look? Story he told me, the colonel just put his drink down, got up and walked away. And now there's tons of information that's been officially released by the DOD. They're publicly talking about it now. It's the only reason I can say what I'm saying without having a guy with black sunglasses come pay me a visit. 10 years ago, that's what would have happened. They're now admitting that, yes, these exotic type UFOs that exhibit the exotic types of propulsion focus around nuclear sites. And so that issue of collapsing Russia, one of Ukraine, collapsing Russia, Russians dying off, preventing those nukes from ending up in the wrong hands where they can be detonated.
Yeah.
That might be where this issue with the war in the Ukraine, the history of Russia, Russia dying off, nuclear weapons, trafficking, UFOs, that's where it ties together.
That is a lot to take in. If I may, putting my Spycraft hat back on, if the United States wanted to justify the existence of its intelligence community and all of its activities, I think selling 10,000 nuclear warheads out of Russia into world markets and the possibility of alien invasion would be pretty compelling stories. How do we, as just the public, how do we sort through the bullshit given all of the complexity? Like, I mean, I hear what you're saying. There's some compelling arguments there. It's interesting. The gears are turning, but how do we know? Like, obviously the Russian thing is a hypothesis about the future. The UFO thing could just be totally fabricated. What are the tools and techniques we can use to filter truth from bullshit?
There are some things you can do. All the evidence I've seen, it's not fabricated. It's very real. It's very real. Here's the tools you can use. There are a lot of charlatans in the pro UFO community. Here's how you can tell them apart. First, you've got to look at the credentials of the people involved. And if they're telling you this is real and they're taking tremendous risk in doing so, that's a good indicator. For example, these whistleblowers that have talked before Congress, Admiral Tim Gallaudet and Lou Elizondo, who was an Army counterintelligence officer and counterintelligence agent. I didn't know him personally, but I know people who ran in his circles. They made tremendous sacrifices to bring this information forward. And I know for a fact there were people in the intel community who went after him hard. Now, he was a smart guy who knew he knew how to use the bureaucracy to fight back. Financially, they almost finished him. I mean, if what he was saying was BS, they wouldn't have gone to all that trouble. So that's something to consider. Other thing is, again, the credentials of the people involved. So you've got the public whistleblowers, Tim Gallaudet, Dave Fravor, Lou Elizondo, and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, Chris Mellon. There's a separate group of whistleblowers that were in the news that came from defense contractors and the military that testified in classified closed hearings that were not made public. I can't talk anything at all about what might have been said in those, but what I can tell you is the day they came out of those hearings, Senator Schumer and Senator Rubio are working on legal language to require defense firms, if they're in possession of alien biologics, to turn it back over to the military. So if they're doing that, if you're an intel analyst, think like an intelligence analyst is kind of what you got to do. What was said there that made a Republican and a Democrat on opposing sides come together that quick and say this language needs to be in a future bill? Can't go into any more detail, but that's the question you ask. Okay, if it was all bullshit, they wouldn't have done that. Then you get to look at the credentials of the people involved. Best example is the guy we were talking about before we started, the case of Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso. That I can talk about because his book was approved for publication by Army Intelligence. I think they might have regretted approving it back in 97, but they did approve it. So, backstory on him. Colonel Philip Corso was one of the most brilliant intelligence and counterintelligence officers we ever produced in World War II. Man was brilliant. Ruthless, too. But it's World War II. You're up against the Nazis, man. You weren't ruthless, they'd kill you. So he took over as chief of security for Allied intelligence in Rome Area Command after 43 when we invaded and occupied Italy. Eisenhower, I think, personally gave him the job because he had done so good with the British commandos in North Africa. And he was originally trained as a radar officer, but they realized he spoke like 3 Italian dialects. They sent him to intelligence school and then put him in counterintelligence. He was pretty effective. Even while we were supposed to be allied with the Russians, I think they tried to kill him a couple of times in World War II because both the Nazi and communist agents, he was using the Italian mafia and the Catholic Church to kill those guys. Well, he retired from the Army in 1963. Last 3 years in, his DD-214s are online. They back this up. You can look if you don't believe me.
Those are his credentials, I assume?
DD-214s are the Cliff Notes version of your service in the military.
Okay. Got it.
That's a way to see if someone's full of crap or not. If some guy comes forward and says, my name's Commander X and I can't tell you what I did in the military, the guy's full of shit. Corso gave his whole record to his publisher and put it all out there for the public to see. Well, from 1961 through 63, he was in charge of something called the Foreign Technology Desk at the Pentagon. Ostensibly, their purpose was to take technology from nations like Switzerland or stuff we got from the Russians and try to see how we could feed it into industry to give us a critical edge in our weapons development. According to what Corso said in his book, The Day After Roswell, he and his boss, General Arthur Trudeau was the famous general who put on sergeant stripes in Pork Chop Hill in Korea and turned the battle around. That was him. What Colonel Corso said was they were reverse engineering artifacts pulled from UFO crash sites in New Mexico. That's what he said.
And what year was this again?
He was in charge of the Foreign Technology Desk in the early 60s.
Early 60s. So right before, I mean, technology did take a leap forward there 20 years after that.
See, that's the thing.
In propulsion technology specifically. Yeah.
So I checked on this because I'm a historian. I know how to research things. My last few months in the Marine Corps, I didn't have a whole lot to do. So I decided to research the history of the things that Corso said they reverse engineer. Lasers, fiber optics, night viewing devices, the integrated circuit. Now, there were a lot of labs working on those things. That's true. But in the early 60s, there were quantum leaps made in all those technologies. They seemed to come out of nowhere. The world scientists were mystified. The Russians, this has been declassified, the Russians and their intelligence services and their scientists like Andrei Sakharov said the Americans could not have done that unless they had something more advanced to key off of, because the research track we had been on was going nowhere. And all of a sudden, all these technologies we make quantum leaps in, all in about 2 or 3 years. And they all came out of laboratories in Fort Belvoir, the main innovations and the quantum leaps we made. That you can verify through actual
That's
just
very
good
compelling.
old-fashioned.
I want to, if there's a point here, I want you to finish it, but I also have a question. I don't know if now's a good time to introduce.
So I'll finish it. So just looking at the credentials of someone who's coming forward
Yeah.
and what they're taking a risk on, if they've got the credentials to back up what they're saying, that's how you can vet the source.
And yes, and your earlier points were also very solid on that as well. Okay, so let's assume that we are that island with guys running around naked, and all of a sudden now aliens are seeing flares and missiles come off that island, and the aliens are curious, if I'm catching the metaphor correctly or the analogy correctly, they're here, right? Or they're at least looking. What's your read on that situation? Are they curious? Or I mean, it seems like if they were hostile, they would have showed up and, what was it, butcher and bolt, as you said?
Or blowing us up with some photon
seemed like that would have
torpedoes
already
or something.
happened,
Yeah, you
right?
would think that. Yeah.
So what are they doing? Like, what's your read on their intent?
So that's for the people in the intelligence community who had to deal with this back in the 40s and 50s. I think that was the fundamental problem. So you see these things. The commander-in-chief, President Eisenhower, is probably going to say, okay, what exactly are they? Who are they? They might say, well, we're not really sure. Well, what do they want? We don't know. So for them, if you've got something like that that seems to exhibit a vastly superior technology, establishing intent becomes critical, because you think, okay, maybe they're hostile.
Usually the intent, if you're reading human history, is it's the butcher and bolt thing.
Yes.
Typically. Sorry.
Yeah, so you think, okay, if you or I are in military intelligence in the 50s, okay, this is where I can give the intelligence community's perspective on why I think they may have done certain things that seemed a bit nefarious. If you're looking at this, you think, okay, these things have a vastly superior technology of some sort. I don't know. We don't know if they're a threat, but what kind of threat would they be if they chose to be? If you're in the intelligence community in the DoD, it is incumbent upon you in a situation like that, if you cannot establish that their intent is benevolent and not hostile,
Right. Hope for the best, plan for the worst.
you have to plan for the worst, and you have to plan for the fact that their becoming hostile may be an absolute certainty. You got to think, okay, if that's the conclusion they came to, what type of things would the intelligence community have to do to prepare for that without telling the American people? You may say, okay, why didn't they just tell people?
Let's start reverse engineering the technology. Yeah.
Well, back then, if you make that public announcement, now the Russians and the Soviets know you got that stuff. They're going to try to grab it. Other thing is, you got to look at it maybe in a cultural context. So think back to television shows in the 1950s. They would never show a husband and wife sleeping in the same bed. They always had separate beds, like with I Love Lucy. Lucy and Ricky, their beds were always separate because maybe the audience couldn't handle the sexual suggestion that a husband and wife slept together. We were extremely socially conservative back then. Well, if you're General Arthur Trudeau, Colonel Philip Corso, Nathan Twining, whoever, or the supposed, theory about the UFO working group Majestic 12, I don't know if it existed or not, who knows. But if you're one of those guys, you're thinking, okay, if the American people would react bad to something as simple as just showing a shared bed of a husband and wife, how might they react if we have to tell them, oh, by the way, we've retrieved, say, hypothetically, these alien spacecraft. Oh, by the way, they can penetrate our airspace and blow our planes down, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it.
Mass hysteria.
Yeah. You have to think about it that way.
So I'm with you on that. Presumptions about the public, or who knows, basically, right? And people are definitely prone to the madness of crowds, I think, as Nietzsche called it. So I agree on that. But then the other point comes to me. It's like, if anything were to unite all of the human race and all of the intelligence agencies and all of the military intelligence and all the assets and all the economies and like directed towards one purpose, I think that would be it in a very practical, economic sense. But oh shit, the green guys are finally here and their intent is bad. What are we going to do? Like we'd have to mobilize at a scale never before seen and unite and integrate and harmonize and cooperate at a scale never before seen. Am I just being overly idealistic, or like, what, I don't know. What's your read on that?
So
if they are here and they've got bad intent, what's your read? What happens? What do we do?
If we can determine that, yes, their intent is bad, we determine, okay, when I was in the intelligence community, if you were President Breedlove, you came to me and said, hey, Intel dude, Matt Reed, what the hell do we do? So, okay, they haven't attacked and invaded us yet. Why? On the plus side, if they're so concerned about our nuclear weapons, that could mean that this is the one weapon we have that can hurt them. They may not have a countermeasure against. Other one is they're constrained by the rules of physics like we are, I'm sure. They're not supernatural, I wouldn't think. And if they can't get enough of them from there to here,
could be a scout.
Then we may have time. The next thing I would say is, okay, we need to find out, if that's the case, who in the defense industry has got these craft, who can reverse engineer. We need to figure out how their technology works, how do we apply it, where are the vulnerabilities, how the hell do we kill the bastards? It's the fastest way to kill them. And if they're traversing the cosmos, we have to also start by asking a fundamental science question that Eric Weinstein brought up. Okay, they got from, say, I don't know, Aldebaran star system, whatever. They got here. How'd they get here? They didn't use rockets. It didn't take them thousands of years. How is that technology working to allow them to go from point A here to point B in Earth? Is there a way to shut that mechanism down? And if we can accomplish the same thing, theoretically, they can hit us here, we can hit them there, that sort of thing. But you have to start by doing all that by taking your intelligence apparatus and saying, every one of you, your focus now is to answer all these questions about who these beings are and how their craft work.
Right.
You basically make that the clear objective. You direct the intelligence community against it. That's how you would start preparing.
That makes sense. I guess that assumes any intelligence community that had that information would be the one trying to hold that information, as intelligence communities tend to do, and act on that information without disclosing it to the rest. But I guess the moment an alien ship bursts through the atmosphere and shoots down one of our planes or something like that for all to see, that would be the moment that everyone would kind of put down.
Yeah.
They would just share the information, right? Like, well, here's what we know. Like, time to organize, mobilize as a species. Presumably. I don't know. Maybe this is overly optimistic. I hope that if humans don't unite globally in that scenario, then there's just no hope for uniting globally, because what else?
Yeah, what else would work?
What else could possibly work? I mean, revolution in consciousness and divine intervention aside, let's say, like an actual, military type, practical, technological event, that would, I would think, be the one that would unify people. And if it did not, that would be very concerning. Anyways, okay, that's very fascinating. I didn't, thank you for sharing about the UFOs. I know very little about them other than that they're in a few movies.
And that's literally the absolute limit of what I can talk about. I cannot say any more on the subject.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing. We're out of time, good sir. And this was an awesome conversation. We went, I don't know, 3 hours, probably 3 hours. Yeah. But you have written 5 books.
Yes, sir.
So in closing thoughts, closing wisdom, tell us a little bit about the 5 books, where people can go to find out more about you or your work.
Absolutely. So the 5 books I write is called the Houston Thriller series. It's mostly military, sci-fi, and techno thrillers. The first book is called In the Death of Night 2.0, And it's a fictional book, but it's loosely based on what we did in World War II, where we used the Italian mafia and organized crime to kill off all the spies that Germans and Italians had on American soil. Oh boy, but they were all dead by like 1943.
Wow.
In this book I wrote, In the Death of Night 2.0, a retired CIA case officer manipulates a Russian mafia syndicate in Houston into killing off all the terror cells that Iran, Syria, and Al-Qaeda have placed into Houston by basically running a private security firm that does bug sweeping work, surveillance countermeasures, but he hides bugs in the offices of his clients, which are the police and the FBI, knows what they're up to, tells the Russians, I'll tell you if, when, how, why, and where the cops and the feds are going to move on you if you kill off all these terrorists who I have information on from a friend of mine, the NSA. That starts the bloodbath. There's good explosives, tradecraft, good tactics, all that stuff. All my experiences are there. I wrote a short story collection called The Jackals of Babylon 2020. A lot of short stories about that kind of stuff. And then I wrote a sci-fi novella called The Time Killers. It's about a group of soldiers who come back in time to the years 1987 to 1990 to stop the aftermath of a future war between the U.S. and China by killing the 4 men who were responsible, who were only in Houston at one point in time in 1990. They're Gen Xers like me, where they go back in time to execute this operation. And so it's got weapons, tradecraft, a lot of intense erotic sex scenes in it, and which are actually important for the next book. But it takes all that and ties it together with a trip back through the fashion, music, and culture of the late 80s, early 90s. Then I wrote a book called Mercenary Twilight about using criminals and hitmen with military backgrounds to kill off all the Chinese spies in a city like Houston. And it's narrated by a guy named Scott Rains, who's a former Marine in the book, but he's based on 2 real-life former U.S. Marines turned hitmen who used to live in Houston named Jimmy O'Banion and Riley Jenkins. First-person narrative. Lots of good tactics and tradecraft. One of the reasons I had to get it cleared, it was scrutinized pretty heavily for those reasons. My most recent book is called The Time Killers, Christina's Tale. It's about 420 pages, I think, but it shows you what happens between the last gunfight and the epilogue in The Time Killers and why the gorgeous call girl, Christina Blackwood, behaved the way she does. So the timeline's been altered, and the soldiers in The Time Killers, when they go back in time, have got these nanites that are reverse engineered from alien technology injected into them, so UFO crash sites tie into both books. And as a result of that, mercenaries from the year 2027 working for a pharmaceutical firm have taken over the time travel facility in Kirtland Air Force Base and are sending mercenaries back in time to grab Christina, to bring her back to the future, to chop her up like a lab rat and get the nanites. But they make a slight mistake in that Bill Carpenter, the CIA case officer from the first book, who's really old by then, manages to send 3 intelligence operatives back to late 1990 to get ahead of the mercenaries and protect Christina Blackwood so that the blood in her body can become a scientific weapons asset later. And that one had a lot of real-life historical characters. UFO lore is tied into atomic bomb lore. Again, a trip back through the fashion and culture of the 80s and late 80s, early 90s is there, all tied together with UFO crash site retrievals, action, tradecraft, what happens to Christina Blackwood. All that's tied together. And there's a real-life decorated soldier in there named Dave Bars, a friend of mine who died recently. He fought in Vietnam, Israel, Rhodesia, and South Africa, a real-life guy. And that Christina's Tale, it pits these numerous mercenaries who are well-equipped with more advanced weapons against a smaller number of guys who fought in Vietnam, Rhodesia, Angola, and South Africa with decades of experience. Who's going to win? And friends of mine, like my dad read, he's a Vietnam vet, praised me on the action sequences. Guys I know who were war veterans who read it said, Matt, I had to put it down a couple times. He says, I was literally having flashbacks, the way you described the tracer rounds, the adrenaline rush, the stingy, what cordite's like when it goes down your lungs, all that stuff.
This is what I wanted to ask you, actually, is obviously your written work is heavily influenced by your career, clearly. Blended with some other things, sounds like. Obviously, there's some sci-fi mixed in there and whatnot, but why is this work so important to you? What's beneath the text of the book? What's in the context? What's the message that you're trying to propagate to the world?
Probably a variety of different messages. So I've always enjoyed writing. I've always had kind of a creative outlet. I've always loved the written word, especially when I was taking Latin in college. That was part of the curriculum there for studying the Romans.
I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what's your intent?
Oh, my intent. So a lot of what I do, the books are also designed not just to entertain, they're designed to educate people who have never been to war and have never been in the intelligence community how the stuff really works. Like, how do explosives actually work? How do you make a shaped charge? How does an anti-tank weapon actually work? How does a thermobaric rocket actually kill people? How does it collapse their lungs? How are the booby traps and explosive devices actually made? What does the blasting cap do? Or what the adrenaline rush is like when the shit's really, really getting heavy and your vision narrows and all your survival instincts and your reptile brain kick in. How does counter-surveillance actually work? Here's how it's actually done. But I do it in an entertaining fashion to pull them in. So they read my books, they'll be thoroughly entertained, but they'll understand, here's how an anti-armor missile works, or that's how these guns actually work. That's what green and red tracers are actually like, hitting a car going over your head. So it was both to entertain, but also give them an education in these matters that they are never going to get from watching Fox, CNN, or MSNBC.
Got it. A dose of reality.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you so much for coming to Miami and talking to me about this. This has been very fascinating. Spanned a lot of ground, right? From ancient Roman military history to fucking UFOs. But it's been a fun ride.
I'll make the closing statement if you don't
Please.
make it quick. If you're interested in my books, obviously go to Amazon.com, type in The Time Killers by Matthew Reed, last name R-E-E-D. You'll obviously pull it up if they're interested. For the rest of the people for everybody out there really, who wants to know how to figure some of these things out, like ancient history and how to fix our problems now, start with a fundamental question. Ask yourself this question. Why is it that generals in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, many of whom were not even old enough to drink in the United States, were able to take legions or phalanxes, go into other countries, smash and annihilate vast enemies in a relatively short amount of time? And yet today, with our vast organizations and hundreds of generals and admirals, we lose wars to poorly armed opponents with nothing more than homemade bombs and bolt-action rifles. Ask yourself why that dichotomy exists. As you study it, seek to answer that question. You'll learn most of what you want to know just like that.
I was hoping you were going to say, what is money? But that's a good question too.
Watch this podcast, obviously.
Thank you so much, man.
Thank you for having me, sir. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.